The hum of the highway had long since faded, replaced by the hushed sibilance of wind through ancient pines. Dr. Elaine Miles gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, though the road ahead was straight and empty, a ribbon of asphalt unspooling into the deepening twilight. She was tired, bone-deep weary in a way that sleep rarely touched anymore. 38 years old, at the zenith of a career most psychologists only dreamed of, published papers, a sought-after private practice, a name murmured with respect in academic circles. Yet she felt utterly, irrevocably hollowed out. The last case, a particularly brutal and protracted one involving generational trauma, had finally broken her meticulous composure, leaving her with an unsettling suspicion that not all wounds could be quantified, not all patterns explained away by cognitive distortion or early childhood attachment. It was a terrifying thought for a woman who built her life on logic and empirical evidence. This house, this distant inheritance from a grandmother she barely remembered, was meant to be her refuge. A quiet place to write, to recalibrate, to perhaps, in her more honest moments, escape the insidious whispers of doubt that had begun to infiltrate her carefully constructed rational world. Blackwood Manor, as the old deeds labeled it, stood nestled deep in the Wiltshire countryside, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, where the very air felt thick with forgotten narratives. The lane narrowed, barely wide enough for her SUV, hedgerows scraping against the paintwork. The trees grew denser, their skeletal branches intertwining overhead, blotting out the last vestiges of the setting sun. The light bled from the sky, taking with it the comforting familiarity of the world she knew. Here even the air changed, growing cooler, carrying the damp, loamy scent of ancient earth and something else, something sweet and decaying like forgotten violets. It clung to her, an unwelcome perfume, intensifying with every mile. Then through a sudden break in the trees she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It rose against the bruised canvas of the sky like a charcoal sketch, stark and uncompromising. Tall, angular, its very architecture seemed to defy the gentle contours of the surrounding landscape. Gables, sharp and numerous, clawed at the clouds. Chimneys, crooked as a witch's grin, spewed phantom smoke into the twilight. Ivy, thick and possessive, draped itself over the gray stonework, lending the house the appearance of a creature slowly being consumed by the earth itself. Windows, dark and vacant, stared out like the eyes of a blind sentinel, reflecting nothing but the encroaching gloom. It was magnificent in a terrifying, desolate way. Elaine cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening after the monotonous purr of the SUV. The cool air that seeped through the open window carried the faint, distant hoot of an owl, and then nothing. Just the profound, oppressive stillness of the countryside at dusk. The house felt less like an inheritance and more like a challenge, an ancient, silent dare issued across 2 decades of forgotten memory. She extracted the heavy, ornate iron key from her handbag, its cold weight a startling contrast to the soft leather. With a deep, bracing breath, she stepped out onto the gravel drive. The stones crunched underfoot, the only sound to break the monumental quiet. The scent of violets was stronger here, clinging to her like a second skin, laced now with a faint, sharp tang of decay. A shiver, not entirely from the chill, traced a path down her spine. The front door was a behemoth of dark, weathered oak, studded with tarnished ironwork. It looked more like the entrance to a crypt than a home. She inserted the key into the lock, the tumblers grating with a sound like old bones cracking. With a grunt she pushed. The door groaned open, unleashing a wave of stagnant air that smelled of dust, lavender, and something else indefinable, something ancient and undisturbed. The darkness inside was absolute, a heavy velvet cloak that swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. She fumbled for her phone, its flashlight beam a pathetic spear against the gloom. It illuminated a vast, echoing entrance hall. High ceilings stretched into unseen heights, adorned with intricate plasterwork obscured by shadows. A grand staircase, its banister swirling with carved roses, ascended into the darkness, its upper reaches lost to sight. Dust motes danced in the solitary beam, thick as snow. "Well, Blackwood," Elaine murmured, her voice unnervingly small in the cavernous space, "you certainly make an impression." Her first few days were a blur of practicalities and the slow, insidious creep of the house's personality. She tackled the monumental task of airing out the rooms, throwing open tall, sash windows that groaned in protest. Fresh air, albeit still carrying the ghost of violets, helped cut through the mustiness. She unpacked her life, a modern existence crammed into cardboard boxes. Sleek laptop, ergonomic chair, neatly organized files of research papers. She set up her office in the study, a grand wood-paneled room that smelled of old leather and forgotten thoughts. Her bright, efficient equipment felt jarringly out of place against the backdrop of ancient leather-bound books and heavy mahogany furniture. She saw it as an act of defiance, a statement of her own logical, ordered world against the house's silent chaos. Reclamation, she thought, wiping dust from a pristine glass screen. "I am reclaiming this space from time, from neglect." Imposing order. But order proved elusive. The house was a symphony of creaks and groans, its ancient timbers shifting and settling with unsettling regularity. Elaine, the scientist, rationalized each sound: thermal expansion, drafts, the natural settling of an old structure. Yet, there were anomalies that gnawed at the edges of her composure. The cold spots. They were distinct, localized pockets of frigid air that would appear seemingly at random. She'd walk into the drawing room, feel a sudden icy current sweep across her skin, then check the windows, the fireplace. Nothing. No discernible draft, no obvious breach in the house's integrity. She even bought a digital thermometer, meticulously charting temperature fluctuations. The readings were baffling, drops of 5, sometimes 10 degrees in specific areas, then a return to ambient temperature within moments, defying any logical explanation of airflow or heat transfer. Then there were the sounds. Faint whispers, like distant sighs, that would almost coalesce into words before dissolving into the general creak and groan of the house. She'd pause, straining her ears, convinced she'd heard her name. But then nothing. Just the wind in the eaves or the groan of pipes. She recorded hours of audio, poring over the playback with headphones, listening for patterns, for anomalies. Mostly static. Sometimes, a faint, almost imperceptible clicking like someone tapping a fingernail on wood or the rustle of fabric. Her professional diagnosis: auditory pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns in random noise. But the sheer frequency of it was exhausting. The scent of violets continued to haunt her. It would bloom unexpectedly in different rooms: the kitchen, the drawing room, even her own bedroom. A sweet, cloying perfume that would intensify, then vanish as quickly as it appeared. She searched for the source. Old sachets, forgotten perfume bottles, dried flower arrangements. Nothing. The house was meticulously empty of such things. Residual scent memory, she'd lecture herself, trapped in the old fabrics, released by changes in humidity. But it was too vivid, too specific. Objects too seemed to have a mind of their own. A specific book she'd left neatly aligned on a shelf would be slightly ajar the next morning. A teacup she'd meticulously placed on a coaster would be subtly shifted, an inch to the left, a fraction turned. She dismissed it as her own absent-mindedness, a product of her exhaustion. Stress, Elaine. You're overtired. Your memory is playing tricks. But the nagging doubt persisted. She found herself subconsciously double-checking everything, turning away from her room, then quickly turning back, trying to catch something in the act. And then there was that room. The back bedroom on the second floor. Her grandmother Margaret had always spoken of it in hushed tones. "That room doesn't like to be disturbed, darling," she'd said, her soft eyes growing distant. "Some places, they have their own ways, their own inhabitants." As a child, Elaine had found it both intriguing and terrifying, a forbidden chamber. As an adult, it held a different kind of dread. The door itself was imposing, a heavier, darker wood than the others, with an ornate, tarnished brass knob. It seemed to exude a palpable coldness, distinct from the general chill of the house. Every time she passed it, she felt a profound sense of otherness, a weight in the air that pressed down on her. She rationalized it, a drafty window, poor insulation, the lack of sunlight. But the consistent, unnerving chill, even when the rest of the upstairs was relatively temperate, defied her logical explanations. She consciously avoided it, walking past with her gaze averted, a primal instinct overriding her intellectual curiosity. On her fifth evening in Blackwood Manor, a sense of profound loneliness began to settle. The grand rooms felt less like a retreat and more like a vast, echoing tomb. The silence, once comforting, now screamed. She tried to recreate a semblance of domestic warmth. She lit a roaring fire in the living room hearth, its flames crackling merrily, chasing away some of the shadows. She brewed a pot of her grandmother's favorite chamomile tea, the herbal aroma a fragile bridge to a gentler past. She chose one of Margaret's old leather-bound books, a collection of local folklore and forgotten legends. The words, however, swam before her eyes, refusing to coalesce into meaning. The shadows from the flickering flames danced too oddly on the walls, twisting into grotesque, fleeting shapes that seemed to writhe at the corners of her vision. She felt an unsettling sensation, as if the very air in the room was thickening, pressing in on her, stealing her breath. The house was no longer merely old, it felt alive. A sentient entity, and she, Elaine Miles, the rational scientist, was merely an unwelcome guest. Her eyelids grew heavy, succumbing to the oppressive atmosphere, her attempts at intellectual engagement dissolving into a hazy stupor. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck 2:13 a.m., its chimes echoing through the vast, dark house with an almost malicious slowness, Elaine awoke with a violent shiver. She was still on the living room couch, the book fallen to the floor. The fire had dwindled to cold, gray ash. The house was plunged into an oppressive darkness, a tangible blackness that seemed to absorb all light and sound. Silent. Terribly, utterly silent. A profound, unnatural cold permeated the room, far deeper than the ambient chill of a dying fire. It wasn't merely cool, it was icy, seeping into her bones. She pulled the wool throw tighter around her, her teeth chattering. Every nerve ending screamed, not from physical cold but from an instinctual dread. Then she heard it. A sound so faint it could have been her imagination, a phantom echo of the settling house. A soft, rhythmic creaking. It came from upstairs. Specifically from the direction of the back room. One creak, then another. A slow, deliberate rocking. Elaine squeezed her eyes shut, digging her nails into her palms. It's just the old house settling. Just the wind. Her scientific mind screamed for a rational explanation, any explanation. But the cold certainty that had settled over her had nothing to do with drafts, and everything to do with a presence, an awareness, a silent, patient waiting. The rocking continued, a soft, hypnotic rhythm in the impenetrable darkness. Somewhere upstairs the back room was no longer silent, and Elaine knew with a horrifying primal certainty that she was no longer alone. The rhythmic creak of the rocking chair upstairs hammered at the walls of Elaine's carefully constructed composure, louder than any alarm bell. It was a slow, deliberate sound, a living sound, not the random groans of an old house. Her breath hitched, catching painfully in her throat. Every nerve ending in her body tightened, a primal, ancient fear clawing its way up from the depths of her scientific detachment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the profound silence of the manor. "No," she whispered, the sound a fragile puff of vapor in the icy air. "No, it's the wind. A draft. Just a draft." She repeated the words, a desperate mantra, trying to coax her racing mind back to the familiar paths of logic. But the distinct, unnatural cold intensified, wrapping around her like a shroud woven from ice, chilling her to the bone despite the thick wool throw. This was not the pervasive chill of a neglected house. This was localized, sentient cold, emanating from the very source of the sound. The creaking continued. Creak, pause, creak, pause. A lullaby of dread. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, strained against the impenetrable darkness of the living room, searching for anything, any shape, any anomaly to latch onto and explain away. But there was nothing, only the oppressive blackness and the relentless, chilling sound from above. The thought of being alone in the vast, ancient house, with something unseen rocking gently upstairs, was almost unbearable. Every shadow seemed to coalesce, every distant creak of the house now a prelude to something infinitely more sinister. Then a new sound, impossibly soft, yet resonating directly inside her skull, bypassed her ears entirely. It was a whisper, delicate as a spider's silk, yet imbued with an ancient sorrow. "Elaine." A gasp tore from her throat. It was her name. Clear. Undeniable. Not a product of tired imagination. It sounded impossibly close, as if breathed directly into her mind. Her hands flew to her temples, pressing as if she could physically push the sound out. "Elaine, come." It came from upstairs. From the hall. From that room. The one Margaret had warned her about. The room that didn't like to be disturbed. A wave of nauseating dread washed over her, mingled with a strange, almost hypnotic pull. It wasn't just fear, it was a profound, magnetic compulsion, a deep-seated curiosity that transcended her terror. A part of her, the psychologist, yearned to understand the phenomenon, to dissect its nature. A deeper, more primal part, a part she hadn't known existed, was simply drawn, inexorably towards the source. Her legs, stiff with fear and cold, seemed to move of their own accord. She slowly pushed herself up from the couch, the forgotten throw falling to the floor with a silent plop. The darkness of the living room was a tangible thing, a heavy cloak she had to push through. Each step towards the hall was an act of profound self-betrayal, a concession to the impossible. She reached the base of the grand staircase, its banister a shadowy spiral leading into the abyss above. The air here was even colder, biting at her exposed skin, making her breath plume in ghostly white clouds. The faint scent of violets, now overpowering and cloying, seemed to emanate from the upper landing, drawing her onward. Each bare footfall on the cold, polished wood of the stairs echoed unnervingly in the profound silence. One step, then another. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the tomb-like stillness. The corridor on the second floor was long and narrow, a tunnel into memory. The peeling wallpaper, with its faded floral patterns, seemed to twist and writhe in the faint light filtering from the distant moonlit window at the end of the hall. Shadows from unseen objects stretched and contracted, turning familiar shapes into grotesque, fleeting figures. The air grew perceptibly colder with each step, a biting, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She stopped outside the back bedroom. The cold here was absolute, an arctic breath escaping from beneath the door. Her breath fogged thickly, a visible testament to the impossible chill. The brass doorknob, she noticed even in the dimness, had a faint sheen of condensation. It was as if the room had been kept at sub-zero temperatures, chilled from the inside. Then, with a slow, agonizing creak that seemed to last an eternity, the door to the back room opened by itself. Just a crack at first, then wider, revealing a slice of utter, impenetrable blackness within. No gust of wind, no settling of timbers. Just a deliberate, slow, silent opening. Elaine stood frozen, caught between flight and an inexplicable urge to step through the threshold. The rational part of her screamed, "Run! Get out!" But the other part, the part that had heard her name, the part that felt the deep, ancient sorrow emanating from within, held her mesmerized. Then the whisper came again, clearer than before, yet still sounding from within her own mind, bypassing her ears entirely. It was a child's voice, imbued with an ancient sorrow, a profound loneliness. "Come, Elaine." And she did. Compulsion overriding every instinct for self-preservation, she took a hesitant step over the threshold. Inside, moonlight, pale and spectral, spilled across the dusty floor through a tall, uncurtained window. Motes of dancing dust, thick as a snowstorm, swirled in the lunar beam, seemingly with a life of their own. The room was sparse, almost skeletal. The bed, a four-poster with carved posts, was untouched, its sheets yellowed with age and riddled with moth-eaten holes, a monument to a long-abandoned sleep. A single rocking chair, its back to Elaine, sat facing the window, a silent sentinel gazing out at the moonlit fields. Empty, or so it seemed. But the scent, violets and mothballs, was overwhelming here, thick and cloying, wrapping around her like a smothering shroud, a sensory memory. She remembered it vividly, curling in her grandmother's lap as a child, breathing that exact same peculiar smell, being told strange, unsettling stories that had always blurred the line between fairy tale and nightmare. Margaret's voice, low and urgent, "That room doesn't like to be disturbed, darling." Her voice, when it came, was a barely audible whisper, fragile and trembling. "Who's there?" From the stillness, a voice, clearer now, yet still impossibly soft, resonated directly inside her head. It was the child's voice, imbued with an ancient sorrow. Not gone. Never gone. And then, with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the rocking chair began to creak. What? Twice. As if an invisible presence had just settled into its worn embrace. Elaine felt a distinct chilling pressure on her right arm, as if a small, cold hand had briefly grasped her sleeve, pulling her further into the room. It was too much. The contact, the voice, the undeniable movement in the empty room. All semblance of scientific detachment shattered. Primal terror seized her. Elaine didn't rationalize. She didn't analyze. She simply ran. A panicked, desperate flight back through the doorway, down the grand staircase, her heart threatening to burst from her chest, the chilling whisper and the rhythmic creak echoing in her ears like a death knell. She bolted the front door, the heavy oak groaning in protest, though she knew with a terrifying certainty that settled deep in her bones, that locks were useless against this. She spent the remainder of the night huddled in the furthest corner of the living room couch, wrapped in the wool throw, watching the faintest gray light of dawn finally seep through the windows, unable to close her eyes. The brutal, unapologetic light of morning seemed to mock her terror. Sunbeams, thick with dancing dust motes, pierced the living room windows, illuminating the untouched teacup on the table, the fallen book, the discarded throw. The profound cold had dissipated, replaced by the usual chill of an unheated old house. The air no longer smelled of cloying violets, but only of dust and aged wood. It was as if the night's events had been nothing but a particularly vivid, terrifying dream. Elaine sat up, every muscle aching, a dull throb behind her eyes. Her scientific mind, a relentless engine of logic, immediately kicked back into gear, desperate to explain away the inexplicable. Sleep paralysis, she thought, reciting the familiar diagnosis. A hypnopompic hallucination. Stress. Overactive imagination fueled by severe sleep deprivation and the oppressive atmosphere of an isolated old house. She repeated these phrases like a mantra, trying to rebuild the walls of her rational world. She made coffee, strong and black, the acrid aroma a comforting anchor in the tangible world. She checked her equipment. The motion sensors were inactive, reporting no movement. The audio recorder had captured hours of silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the house or the distant hoot of an owl, no whispers, no rocking. The temperature logs showed a brief, inexplicable dip around 2:15 a.m. in the living room, but nothing further upstairs. No smoking gun. Nothing concrete enough to stand up to peer review. The lack of empirical evidence should have been a comfort. Instead, it was infuriating. Her own senses, her own terror, contradicted the cold, hard data. And she, a professional who relied on observable phenomena, was forced to confront the unnerving possibility that her senses, for the first time, were telling a truth her instruments could not capture. She walked slowly up the stairs, her feet heavy, drawn by a mixture of lingering fear and morbid curiosity. The corridor upstairs was just as it had been, peeling wallpaper, dusty floorboards. The back room door was closed. Tightly closed. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers brushing the brass knob. It was cool but not icy. No condensation. She took a deep breath, trying to dispel the memory of the previous night's terror. Was it all a dream? Was she losing her mind? Her gaze fell on an antique mahogany desk tucked into an alcove on the landing, laden with forgotten papers. It was Margaret's desk, she realized. Her grandmother had spent countless hours here, writing letters, balancing ledgers. A sudden, intuitive urge struck her. If scientific equipment couldn't explain it, perhaps Margaret's own experiences could. Margaret had hinted at something. Warned her. There had to be something here. She began to sift through the papers, neatly stacked but covered in a thick layer of dust. Old tax receipts, faded postcards, dried botanical specimens pressed between brittle sheets of paper. It took nearly an hour of patient, meticulous searching. Then, tucked beneath a stack of late 1980s utility bills, held in place by a heavy ornate paperweight, she found them. A set of 3 leather-bound journals. Their covers were cracked with age, the leather dry and almost crumbling. They smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the same scent that permeated the house. Margaret's elegant, looping handwriting adorned the first page of the earliest journal. Margaret Elizabeth Miles, Spring 1965. Elaine settled into the dusty armchair beside the desk, the journals balanced on her lap. She began to read. The early entries were mundane, domestic observations, garden notes, local gossip, recipes, meticulous records of household expenses. Margaret's voice emerged from the pages, precise, observant, a woman rooted in the routines of her quiet life. But as Elaine turned the brittle pages, the tone began to shift. Imperceptibly at first. A new urgency seeped into the prose, a growing sense of unease. Small, seemingly innocuous observations gave way to something else. The cold comes from within the walls now. It settles in my bones even by the fire. Marginalia, not natural. She knocks when no one else hears. A faint tap, tap, tap. Always on the back bedroom door. Elaine felt a familiar chill creep up her spine, despite the sunlight streaming through the landing window. Margaret had experienced the cold. Margaret had heard the knocking. Then the name appeared. Faintly at first, almost scribbled out as if Margaret had been afraid to commit it to paper. She whispers. Says she's still cold. Still waiting. Says, Clara. Elaine's breath hitched. Clara. The name from the whisper in her mind. The name that haunted Margaret's later entries, scrawled repeatedly in the margins of her ledgers. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't psychosis. Margaret had known. Margaret had suffered. She flipped through the next journal, desperate for more. The entries grew more erratic, more desperate. Clara is angry. Clara is lonely. She wants company. She wants to be seen. A profound sense of dread settled over Elaine. Her grandmother hadn't been merely eccentric, she had been tormented. And the source of that torment, it seemed, was Clara. The woman of science, the psychologist, felt a terrifying shift in her worldview. The rational explanations were failing her. Margaret's words were too specific, too chillingly familiar. She continued to read, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages, each rustle a whisper of its own. The house, once merely old, now felt like a living archive of pain, its secrets slowly bleeding from the brittle pages of Margaret's confessions. The journals held the key, the answers, and perhaps a terrifying truth about Clara and about Blackwood Manor that would irrevocably shatter Elaine's world. The leather of Margaret's journals was dry and cool beneath Elaine's fingertips, each page a brittle testament to a life lived, and a sanity slowly unraveling. The thin, almost translucent paper felt like ancient skin, fragile and holding secrets. Elaine lost herself in the meticulously penned script, the initial neatness of Margaret's hand gradually dissolving into a frantic scrawl, words underlined multiple times, exclamation points stabbed into the paper like desperate cries. The sun, which had risen with such defiant clarity, began its slow descent, its light deepening to amber, then to a dusty rose, finally fading as the shadows stretched and coalesced in the vast old study. Elaine barely noticed the passage of time. Margaret's early entries, still calm and collected, spoke of the rhythms of country life, seasonal changes in the garden, local parish meetings, tea with Mrs. Henderson down the lane. But even here, hints of a peculiar sensitivity emerged. "The air often feels heavy before a storm," Margaret had written, "but lately, it is a different sort of pressure. As if something unseen presses against the glass." Or, "A faint melody tonight, almost like a child humming. Perhaps the wind, though the windows are sealed tight." Elaine initially dismissed these as poetic observations, the musings of an isolated woman. But then came the shift, stark and undeniable. The date March 10, 1968, marked in bold, underlined twice. "The knocking began last night. Faint. Insistent. From the back bedroom. Not the wind. I listened for hours. It matched the rhythm of my own heart." Elaine's own heart gave an involuntary lurch. Margaret had heard it too. The same chilling rhythmic sound. As Elaine read, the familiar scent of violets, cloying and sweet, began to permeate the study. It wasn't a faint whiff this time. It was strong, almost overwhelming, as if a bushel of the flowers had been crushed right beside her. She glanced around, half expecting to see a bouquet, but the room was empty of any fresh blooms. The scent simply was conjured from the very air, tying the present to Margaret's terrifying past. A shiver traced her spine, a ghost of a cold touch. Margaret's entries grew more detailed, more desperate. "She calls to me. Not with words, not always. Sometimes it's a feeling. A cold despair. A longing. And later, I tried speaking to her. Asked her name. A child's voice. So faint. So sad. She said, 'Claire.' My heart breaks for her." Elaine felt a wave of profound sorrow, mixed with intellectual fascination. This wasn't just a haunting. This was the unfolding of a shared psychological ordeal across generations. Her grandmother, like her, a logical woman, had been forced to confront the inexplicable. But Margaret had been alone, without the language of trauma and repression that Elaine possessed. She had simply suffered. The journals became a psychological map of Margaret's increasing distress. She described trying to understand Clara, trying to appease her. She spoke of leaving small offerings in the back room, fresh flowers, old toys, attempts to soothe an unseen presence. She likes the little porcelain doll. It reminds her of something. Her tears still fall when I touch it. Elaine vaguely remembered a chipped porcelain doll with blonde curls that Margaret had kept on her mantelpiece, a doll Elaine, as a child, had found oddly unsettling. Margaret also documented Clara's growing demands. She wants to be known, to be seen, to be heard. She says they locked her away because she was different, because she saw things. This phrase, saw things, resonated with Elaine. Had Clara possessed some form of sensory sensitivity, perhaps a synesthesia, or a more profound psychic ability that had been misunderstood and feared in her time? The thought opened a new, terrifying avenue of possibility. If Clara saw things, perhaps Elaine was now beginning to see them too. The entries for June 1933 became particularly disturbing. Margaret circled and underlined the date June 12, 1933, repeatedly, almost violently. Her handwriting devolved into a frantic scribble, often illegible. "The water. Oh, the water. I begged them. I begged them. It wasn't madness. It was fear. Pure fear. They didn't understand. No one understood. And then, horrifyingly, the silence after. Worse than the screams. So cold. So final. My fault. All my fault. Elaine felt a cold dread settle deep in her stomach. The water. My fault. It strongly implied a drowning. And Margaret's guilt. Driven by a desperate need for concrete evidence, something tangible beyond the spectral whispers and the agonizing confessions of a woman whose own sanity had frayed, Elaine opened her laptop. She began a furious search. Clara Miles. Birth records, Wiltshire, 1920s to 1930s. She scoured online genealogy databases, National Archives, local census records. Nothing. Not a single Clara Miles in Wiltshire born in that general period who could logically be Margaret's sister or relative. She broadened her search to surrounding counties, even different spellings. Still nothing. The name was a ghost in the official records. She then focused on the date, June 12, 1933. Drowning accidents, child deaths, Wiltshire. She found reports of minor floods, a tragic accident involving a farmhand, but nothing, absolutely nothing about a child drowning on or near the Miles property. It was as if Clara Miles had never existed officially. This is a delusion, Elaine's scientific mind screamed. Margaret suffered from a progressive mental illness. She concocted this elaborate narrative, and your own exhaustion and suggestibility are making you vulnerable to it. The logical explanation was sound, reassuring even. But the memories of the icy chill, the distinct scent of violets, the impossible creak of the rocking chair in an empty room, the whisper that called her name from within her very mind, these memories were too vivid, too visceral, to be dismissed as mere psychological phenomena. As she typed, hunched over the glowing screen in the deepening twilight of the study, a faint, almost inaudible sigh seemed to drift past her ear. It was light as a breath, yet it carried an immense sorrow, a profound loneliness. She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She strained to hear it again, but it was gone, swallowed by the settling silence of the house. Had she imagined it? The onset of auditory hallucinations, a classic symptom of extreme stress and sleep deprivation. Yet it felt so real. So close. She glanced towards the study door, which stood ajar. The hallway beyond was a pool of deepening shadow. And from that shadow she felt a distinct, unwavering chill. It wasn't the pervasive cold of the house. It was a targeted, focused, icy touch, reaching for her. And then, faintly, undeniably, a single soft rap on the doorframe. Tap, tap, tap. Just like Margaret had described. Elaine snatched her hand back from the keyboard as if burned. Her breath hitched. The house felt like a living thing responding to her investigation, breathing around her. It was as if she were digging up a grave, and the occupant was stirring. The utter absence of Clara in any official records was more terrifying than any ghost story. It suggested a secret so profoundly buried, so deliberately erased, that it defied normal detection. Who was Clara? Why was she hidden? And why did Margaret feel such crushing guilt? Elaine pushed back from the desk, the journal still open to the desperate entries about Clara and the water. She couldn't find the answers here, isolated in this house. She needed to venture out, to speak to people, to find someone, anyone who might remember a forgotten tragedy, a hushed secret. She needed to look beyond the cold, hard data and into the murky waters of local lore, hushed whispers, and long-buried family shame. She needed to visit the local library archives in person, interview elderly residents, dig through dusty church records. She needed to find the truth about Clara before Clara, or whatever she was, found its complete truth in her. And a chilling thought, borrowed unbidden from Margaret's desperate words, echoed in her mind. She wants to be seen, to be known, to be heard. Elaine was beginning to hear her. But what would happen when Clara was truly seen? The harsh morning light that filtered into Blackwood Manor offered no comfort. If anything, it made the spectral chill of the previous night's encounter feel even more insidious, a secret known only to her, the house, and the chilling confessions of her grandmother's journals. Elaine needed answers that went beyond the dusty pages of a private diary. She needed external validation, objective truth, something to anchor her sanity against the rising tide of the supernatural. The town of Oak Haven, the nearest point of civilization, beckoned with the promise of archives, records, and the long memories of its inhabitants. The drive from the manor to Oak Haven was a jarring transition. The winding, overgrown lane eventually gave way to a smoother tarmac road, bordered by manicured fields. The air lost its ancient, earthy scent, replaced by the faint tang of diesel and freshly cut grass. Oak Haven itself was a picturesque tableau of quaint stone cottages, a thriving village green, and a church whose spire, impossibly old, seemed to pierce the very clouds. It exuded a sleepy charm, a place where time moved at a slower, more predictable pace. But beneath the veneer of idyllic tranquility, Elaine sensed the quiet insularity of a small community, a place where secrets were guarded fiercely, passed down in hushed tones rather than written in public records. Her first stop was the Oak Haven Public Library and Local History Archive, a charming, albeit small, building tucked behind the village church. The interior smelled of old paper, polish, and a faint, comforting hint of tea. Behind a sturdy oak counter sat Martha, the librarian. She was a woman in her late 60s, with kind, crinkling eyes and hair the color of spun silver, pulled back in a neat bun. Martha was the very embodiment of local knowledge, a living index of Oak Haven's past. "Can I help you, dear?" Martha's voice was warm, tinged with a melodic Wiltshire lilt. Elaine forced a professional smile. "Yes, thank you. I'm Dr. Elaine Miles. I've recently inherited Blackwood Manor, the old Miles family estate. I'm hoping to do some research into my family history, perhaps find old records pertaining to the property, the people who lived there." Martha's kind eyes brightened with interest. "Oh, the old manor. Yes, a beautiful if a little quiet place. Welcome to Oak Haven, Dr. Miles. Most people who inherit it usually sell it on. It's lovely to have a Miles back. What sort of records are you looking for?" Elaine started broad, feeling her way. "Anything really. Old census records, local newspaper archives, perhaps church records if they're held here. I'm particularly interested in the period around the 1930s. Martha nodded, her fingers already dancing over a worn wooden card catalog. "The 30s, yes, a challenging time for many. We have quite a collection. The local gazette, parish registers for births, deaths, and marriages, and even some old property deeds. Let me set you up. For the next few hours, Elaine was immersed in the tactile world of history. The pages of the Oakhaven Gazette were brittle and yellowed, smelling faintly of acidic paper. She wore thin archival gloves as she carefully turned them, her eyes scanning for familiar names, for any mention of the Miles family, or more specifically, any mention of a Clara. She found snippets of mundane life, advertisements for local bakeries, reports of village fetes, notices of births and deaths. The world of 1933 Oakhaven unfolded before her, a stark contrast to her own. Attitudes towards mental health, she noted in her internal monologue, were far less nuanced. News articles occasionally mentioned lunacy asylums, or homes for the feeble-minded, with a chilling detachment. The fear of social stigma was palpable even in the formal language of the time. This cultural context was crucial. If Clara truly was different, her family might indeed have gone to extreme lengths to hide her. She found several mentions of her great-grandparents, Margaret's parents, in the social pages, attending church functions, hosting small gatherings. They seemed outwardly respectable pillars of the community. Nothing to suggest a dark secret. Nothing about a child named Clara. The more she searched, the more the sense of frustration grew. The records were meticulously kept, yet Clara remained a ghost. No birth certificate. No school enrollment. No mention in the census data for the Miles household. It was as if she had been erased or simply never existed in the official world. As the afternoon wore on, Martha, initially so helpful, became subtly less so. When Elaine began asking specifically about any unusual children or family secrets connected to the Miles lineage, Martha's cheerful demeanor stiffened. "The Miles family are old stock, dear," Martha said, her voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial murmur. "Proud people. Keep themselves to themselves. There are always stories, of course, in any old family. But nothing for the official record, I assure you." Her eyes, though still kind, held a new wariness, a flicker of something unsaid. It was the same look Elaine had seen in the eyes of patients guarding a deeply buried trauma. Elaine tried a different tack. "I'm also interested in local tragedies from that period. Drowning incidents, perhaps, around June 1933. Martha paused, her hand hovering over a dusty ledger. "Drowning, you say? Well, there was poor old Farmer Giles's boy fell into the millstream, but that was 35. And the flood of 31, of course, but no lives lost that time, thankfully. Nothing specific to 33 that comes to mind, dear. It was a dry summer, as I recall." Her response was a little too quick, a little too definitive. Elaine thanked her, feigning disinterest, but the interaction confirmed her suspicion. There was something here, something that the town preferred to keep buried. The small silver locket, heavy and impossibly cold, felt like a burning coal in Elaine's palm. The engraved initials, CM, seemed to sear her skin. It was undeniable proof, a tangible link to the spectral presence that haunted Blackwood Manor, a piece of a mystery that defied logic and mocked her scientific training. She hadn't found it in a dusty archive, but inexplicably, tragically, by the side of the road, as if deliberately placed for her to find. The profound wave of loneliness that had washed over her was chilling. It was not her own despair, but an echo, a psychic imprint from the locket itself, from Clara. She stumbled back to her SUV, the locket clutched tight. The journey back to the manor was a blur of heightened senses. Every shadow cast by her headlights seemed to writhe, every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered accusation. The scent of violets, cloying and omnipresent now, filled the car, making her head ache. When she finally pulled into the gravel drive, Blackwood Manor loomed, not as a desolate refuge, but as a vast, silent maw ready to consume her. Inside, the house felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, charged with an almost palpable energy. The subtle disturbances she had rationalized away were now constant. Doors creaked open and shut when no one was near. Faint, distant music, like a child's lullaby played on a tinny music box, drifted from unseen corners. The cold spots intensified, moving through rooms like invisible specters, leaving patches of icy air in their wake. Her meticulously placed books were askew, her papers scattered. The house was no longer merely responding. It was actively asserting its presence, mocking her attempts at order. Elaine retreated to the study, the locket still clutched in her hand. She sat at Margaret's old desk, the journals open, their brittle pages a testament to her grandmother's unraveling sanity. She tried to pry open the locket, but the clasp was stubbornly seized with age and tarnish. Frustration, mixed with a growing sense of desperation, clawed at her. She needed to know what was inside. She needed more answers. As darkness fully descended, blanketing the manor in an oppressive shroud, the whispers began again. Not the subtle, almost imagined sighs from before. These were clearer, closer. She tried to hide me, so cold, so lonely. The voice, a child's, resonated directly in her mind, bypassing her ears, creating a terrifying intimacy. It was Clara. No doubt remained. The magnetic pull to the back room, previously resisted, now became an irresistible force. It wasn't a choice, it was a compulsion. She found herself walking towards the staircase, the locket still in her hand. The temperature dropped with each step, her breath fogging in the icy air. When she reached the landing, the back room door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning. This time there was no hesitation, no frantic retreat. Only an overwhelming urge to enter, to understand, to witness. She stepped over the threshold into the absolute zero of the room. The moment she crossed it, everything changed. It wasn't a sudden, violent shift, but a pervasive, insidious transformation of reality itself. Time seemed to stretch and blur, becoming an endless, suffocating present. The outside world, the distant hoot of owls, the rustle of leaves, even the pounding of her own heart, vanished, absorbed by an overwhelming, profound presence. The air itself hummed with an unseen energy, vibrant and alive, yet filled with an ancient sorrow. The moonlight, pale and spectral, poured through the uncurtained window, illuminating the swirling motes of dust that danced in the beam like tiny agitated spirits. The bed stood skeletal, its moth-eaten sheets illuminated. The rocking chair, facing the window, creaked softly, rhythmically, as if an invisible weight had settled into its embrace. Elaine walked towards it, her movements slow, dreamlike. The locket, still in her hand, felt suddenly warm, pulsing faintly. She sat in the rocking chair, its worn wood smooth beneath her fingers. As her weight settled, the chair rocked once, a slow, deliberate swing. And then the visions began. They were not fleeting images, but full, immersive sensory experiences that bypassed her eyes entirely, playing directly on the screen of her mind. She was there. The room dissolved around her, replaced by a past that was more real than the present. She saw a little girl no older than 9 with wild dark hair and eyes uncannily like her own. It was Clara. Clara was pounding frantically on the heavy wooden door of the back room, her small fists connecting with dull, desperate thuds. Her face was smeared with tears, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Let me out. Please. I didn't mean to. I just saw them," she cried, her voice echoing in Elaine's mind with terrifying clarity. Elaine felt the cold hardwood against Clara's small hands. She smelled the dust and the faint, sweet scent of violets that Clara had tried to crush for comfort. She heard the arguments from beyond the door, a stern, disembodied female voice, sharp with disapproval, Clara's mother, Elaine's great-grandmother, and a softer, more pleading voice choked with fear, Margaret. "She's not right, Margaret. Not right. She sees things. She talks to people who aren't there. It's a sickness. We have to keep her contained," the stern voice hissed, laced with a terrifying blend of fear and shame. "But Mother, she's only a child. She doesn't understand." Margaret's voice, younger, full of anguish. Elaine, still aware of her own body in the rocking chair, could feel Clara's overwhelming despair, her crushing loneliness, the profound injustice of her confinement. She saw Clara curled in a corner, rocking herself, whispering to unseen friends, drawing intricate, fantastical figures on the walls with stolen charcoal. She saw the fear in Clara's eyes, the way she flinched at loud noises, the way she shrank from direct sunlight. Clara wasn't mad, she was sensitive, profoundly so, to a world unseen by others. She was different. Wrong about what, Clara? Elaine whispered, her voice barely a breath, merging with the visions. The psychologist in her, the part that sought to understand and heal, took over. She began whispering to the spectral girl, a gentle, soothing cadence. Asking questions, promising to listen, promising to understand. "What did you see?" The response was not words but a wave of fear, then resentment, then a profound relief. As if Clara had finally found someone who didn't judge, who didn't fear, but simply heard. And the house responded. A book, a heavy tome of forgotten poetry from a distant shelf, slid from its perch, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor, startling Elaine back to the present moment for a split second. The single electric lamp she had plugged in earlier in the hall flickered erratically, casting wild, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic Clara's frantic movements in the visions. The air grew heavy, not with malice but with an immense, suffocating sorrow. It was the weight of unspoken grief, of desperate longing, of a childhood stolen. Just desperate. Elaine stayed there for hours, lost in the spectral dialogue. The visions continued, interspersed with Clara's direct, silent communication within her mind. Clara showed her moments of brief joy, a stolen moment in the garden, a kind word from Margaret. But mostly, it was the crushing monotony of confinement, the terror of the dark, the desperate yearning for freedom. Elaine felt the boundary between her consciousness and Clara's dissolving. She was no longer just an observer, she was a participant, experiencing Clara's memories as her own. The locket in her hand grew warmer still, pulsing with a faint, steady beat, as if Clara's own heart was beating within it. As dawn approached, painting the window with streaks of pale gray, the visions faded. The heavy presence in the room lightened, though the scent of violets remained strong. Elaine became aware of her aching body, the stiffness in her neck, the cold seeping into her bones. She slowly rose from the rocking chair. The room once again was silent, empty. Just motes of dust dancing in the early light. But it wasn't truly empty. It was imbued with a profound, terrifying new understanding. Elaine looked down at the locket in her hand. The clasp, previously seized, was now slightly ajar. With a tremor, she gently pressed it open. Inside, tarnished but intact, lay two tiny, sepia-toned photographs. One was of the stern-faced woman she now knew as her great-grandmother, Clara's mother. The other was Clara. A child with dark, solemn eyes, uncannily similar to Elaine's own. And on the reverse side of Clara's photo, written in faded ink, was a single chilling word: lost. Not dead. Lost. Elaine's gaze lingered on Clara's face, then flickered to her own reflection in the window pane. The resemblance was uncanny, chilling. Not just the eyes, but the curve of the chin, the shape of the mouth. A shared lineage, a shared sensitivity, perhaps a shared fate. "You're not lost, Clara," Elaine whispered aloud, her voice hoarse, thick with a profound sorrow that felt both her own and Clara's. "I see you. I hear you." And as she spoke, the rocking chair behind her creaked softly. "What?" A gentle, almost contented sound. Not a cry for help, but a quiet acknowledgement. Clara had been seen. And Elaine knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was only the beginning. The house had held its secrets for decades. Now, through her, it was finally ready to tell its story. And Elaine, the rational psychologist, was irrevocably bound to be its vessel. The locket lay open in Elaine's palm, the sepia faces of Clara and her stern-faced mother staring up at her, timeless and tragic. The single word "lost" inscribed on Clara's photograph echoed in Elaine's mind, a mournful refrain. She felt profoundly altered by the night's immersive visions, by the terrifying intimacy of Clara's story. The line between dream and reality, between her own memories and Clara's, had not just blurred, it had almost dissolved entirely. She was no longer just an observer, she was a conduit, a vessel through which a forgotten trauma pulsed with renewed life. She moved from the back room, the locket still clutched in her hand, and made her way back to the study. The sun was fully risen now, casting long dusty beams across the ancient floorboards, but the warmth felt superficial, unable to penetrate the internal chill that had settled in her bones. She sat at Margaret's desk, the journal still open to the frantic entries, and picked up her own notebook, where she diligently scribbled observations and theories in the neat hand of a seasoned psychologist. As her gaze drifted over the pages, her breath hitched. Her own handwriting stared back at her, bold and unmistakable, scrawled across one of the recent pages, superimposed over her precise notes on cognitive dissonance. Clara Miles. June 12, 1933. The date was circled repeatedly, almost violently, just as Margaret had marked it in her own journals. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had written it unconsciously, while lost in the depths of sleep deprivation, or perhaps while Clara's influence had already begun to seep into her subconscious. It was a terrifying confirmation that the boundaries of her own mind were being breached, that Clara was not just a separate entity whispering from the ether, but a presence actively intertwining with her very thoughts. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over her, followed quickly by a surge of desperate understanding. Clara wasn't just haunting the house. She was reaching out, seeking completion, perhaps even seeking a second chance at life through Elaine. She pushed her own notebook aside, picking up Margaret's journals again, her hands trembling. Armed with the knowledge from the locket, from the visions, and from her own chilling subconscious scrawl, she began to reread them. This time the cryptic entries weren't just disturbing, they were agonizingly clear. Margaret's early attempts to record Clara's gifts were heartbreaking. Clara sees the colors. One entry read, dated spring 1929. She says the air around Mother is gray and sharp like glass. But around the roses, it is soft gold. I try to understand. Her eyes are so wide when she describes them. Is this a blessing? Or a curse? Clara, Elaine now understood, wasn't just seeing unseen entities. She likely experienced a profound form of synesthesia, a mingling of senses, seeing auras, feeling emotions as colors, perceiving the world with an overwhelming intensity that others couldn't fathom. In the rigid, pragmatic world of the 1930s countryside, such a child would be labeled at best peculiar, at worst insane. The entries documenting her great-grandmother's reaction were chilling. Mother says it is the devil's work, a sickness in the mind. She screams at Clara to stop imagining. Clara just cries. She cannot stop seeing. The severity of the great-grandmother's reaction was painted in stark, brutal strokes. Fear and social stigma, Elaine knew from her own practice, could drive people to horrific acts, especially when confronted with the unexplainable. Margaret's conflict was palpable on the page. She loved her younger sister, Clara, fiercely. She tried to protect her, to soothe her, to understand her strange perceptions. But she was powerless against the iron will of her mother, the matriarch who dictated the family's rigid adherence to propriety and perceived normalcy. Mother insisted on the back room, Margaret wrote in a barely legible scrawl, dated 1932. For Clara's own good, to protect her from herself, and us from her strangeness. Clara cries all night. I sneak her food, tell her stories. But the door, it is always locked now. The entries from this period were interspersed with frantic pleas to God, desperate prayers for guidance, for a cure, for escape. Margaret's guilt even then was a raw, festering wound. She was a silent witness, perhaps even an unwilling participant in Clara's slow torture. Then came June 1933. The specific date, June 12th, was circled and underlined so many times the paper was thin and almost torn. The writing dissolved into an incoherent frenzy of despair, only fragments legible. The pond? Mother said, for her own good, she struggled. The water, so cold. I couldn't. Forgiveness. Please God, forgive me. Clara, my little Clara, gone, but not gone. The final phrase, gone, but not gone, resonated with Elaine, echoing Clara's own spectral whisper. It was the crushing weight of a secret too terrible to speak, too heavy to bear alone. Margaret had known the full truth, and she had lived with it, trapped in the same house that held Clara's tormented spirit for decades. Elaine closed the journals, the weight of the collective sorrow pressing down on her. The house, Margaret, Clara, they were all inextricably linked by this unspeakable tragedy. And the recurring phrase, the water, left no doubt as to the manner of Clara's death. She had to see it. The pond. Driven by a grim determination, Elaine left the study, the locket still clutched in her hand. The house felt more alive than ever, its creaks and groans resonating with the anguish she had just unearthed. The scent of violets was no longer just a faint perfume. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the very air was weeping. She found the path to the pond easily enough, a faint, overgrown track leading away from the back of the house, swallowed by untamed rhododendrons and ancient oaks. The air grew damp and heavy as she walked, the ground soft beneath her boots. The sun, previously so bright, struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of trees, casting the path in perpetual twilight. Then she saw it. Tucked away, almost hidden by weeping willows and thickets of brambles, was the pond. It was small, stagnant, its surface choked with green algae and lily pads. The water was unnaturally still, a dark, reflective mirror that seemed to absorb all light and sound. No birds chirped here, no insects buzzed. The silence was profound, unsettling. As Elaine approached the water's edge, the cold intensified, emanating directly from the pond itself. It was the same chilling cold she felt from the back room, from the locket, from Clara. The scent of violets was overwhelming here, almost sickly sweet, mingled with the earthy smell of damp, decaying vegetation. She stood at the bank, peering into the murky depths. The surface looked deceptively calm, but beneath it she felt a profound sense of turmoil, of struggle. The air around her shimmered, not with heat, but with a psychic residue, a lingering imprint of terror. Then the visions began again, clearer, more violent than before. But this time they were infused with Margaret's agony. Elaine saw Clara again, a small, frightened figure, struggling against the strong hands of her mother. The great-grandmother's face was a mask of cold resolve, twisted by fear and a perverse sense of duty. "It's for your own good, child. The Lord will cleanse you," she hissed, her voice a harsh, disembodied echo in Elaine's mind. Margaret was there too, a younger version, perhaps 16 or 17, standing by the pond's edge, paralyzed with terror. She was crying, begging. "No, Mother. Please. She'll drown. Clara." But she was too afraid to intervene, too small against the will of her formidable parent. Elaine felt Margaret's helplessness, her agonizing guilt, the crushing weight of complicity even in inaction. Clara screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound that tore through Elaine's mind. She saw Clara's small hands reaching, grasping at the air, at the reeds, as she was forced into the icy green water. She felt the sudden, shocking cold, the immediate panic, the burning in her lungs as the water rushed in. The thrashing, the desperate struggle, the bubbles. Then the terrifying, absolute stillness. The pond's surface calm once more, reflecting the indifferent sky. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Elaine gasping for breath, clutching her chest, a phantom pain in her lungs. She stumbled back from the pond, her legs weak, tears streaming down her face. It was not just Clara's death she had witnessed, it was Margaret's profound and enduring trauma relived through her. The locket in her hand pulsed with a faint, sorrowful warmth, a tangible connection to the child whose last moments she had just experienced. The loneliness she had felt earlier now mingled with a deep, crushing despair, and a profound, echoing sense of betrayal. Clara had been betrayed not just by her mother, but by a world that could not understand her, by a system that condemned her, and by a sister who loved her but was too terrified to save her. As Elaine stood there, trembling, the faint, sweet scent of violets intensified around the pond, then, with an audible shimmer in the air, solidified into a palpable presence. It wasn't just Clara anymore. It was an entity far older, far more potent, drawn to the tragedy, nourished by the lingering pain. The trees around the pond seemed to press in, their branches twisting into grotesque, grasping forms. The surface of the water rippled, not from wind but from an unseen force beneath. Then from the depths of the pond, a new sound emerged. A low, mournful hum. Not Clara's childish lullaby but something deeper, something ancient and primal, that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. It was the sound of the land itself, lamenting. A sound that echoed the whispers in the house, but carried an infinitely greater power, a profound, consuming hunger. Elaine felt a terrifying realization dawn upon her. Clara was not just a ghost. She was tied to something larger, something rooted in the very land of Blackwood Manor, something that fed on the suffering and the secrets hidden here. The house was not merely haunted by Clara, it was haunted with Clara and perhaps with other forgotten tragedies that had nourished this dark, ancient presence. She had sought answers. She had found a truth far more complex and terrifying than she could have imagined. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that the full price of this knowledge had yet to be exacted. Clara wanted to be seen, to be known. But what would Clara become once truly seen? And what would Elaine become in the process? The hum from the pond deepened, almost a siren call, beckoning her closer, promising a final, terrifying clarity. The low, mournful hum from the pond reverberated through Elaine's very bones, a primal vibration that spoke of ancient sorrows and consuming hungers. It was distinct from Clara's plaintive whispers, older, darker, resonating from the very earth itself. The locket, still clutched in her hand, grew intensely cold, then pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible heat, as if reacting to the immense, unseen power emanating from the water. Elaine stumbled backward, away from the pond's edge, her mind reeling. Clara was not alone. The house, the land, was bound to something else, something vast and primordial, a dark entity that had been nourished by generations of suffering within Blackwood Manor. She fled the pond, not running, but walking with a desperate urgency, as if the very air behind her was solidifying into grasping hands. The path back to the house, previously shadowed, now felt like a tunnel into deeper darkness, each rustle of leaves a whispered warning. When she finally burst through the back door of Blackwood Manor, she slammed it shut, leaning against the cold wood, gasping for breath. The familiar musty scent of the house, once merely old, now felt like the very breath of a monstrous living thing. The revelations of the pond had shattered the last vestiges of Elaine's rational mind. There was no denying it now, the supernatural was terrifyingly real. And she, a woman who had dedicated her life to dissecting human behavior, found herself confronting a reality that defied every textbook, every diagnostic criterion. Her understanding of the world was fracturing, piece by agonizing piece. The following days bled into a waking nightmare. Elaine stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped answering the insistent calls that buzzed from her forgotten phone in the study. The outside world, her prestigious career, her meticulously ordered life, seemed distant, irrelevant, a fragile illusion crumbling around her. Her appearance deteriorated. Her skin grew paler, almost translucent, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes, once sharp and analytical, became wide and distant, haunted by unseen terrors, rimmed with dark circles. She wore the same clothes for days, stained with dust and the lingering scent of violets. Her once precise movements became jerky, uncoordinated, as if her limbs were no longer entirely her own. Clara's presence was no longer limited to whispers and visions in the back room. She was everywhere. Elaine heard her childish laughter echoing from empty hallways, her faint sobs from the attic, the soft patter of her bare feet on the stairs. The rocking chair in the back room would creak rhythmically throughout the day, a constant, chilling reminder of the presence. The boundaries of Elaine's consciousness continued to erode. She would find herself humming Clara's lullaby, a mournful, haunting melody she had only heard in visions, her own voice sounding strangely childlike. She would pick up objects, a faded teacup, a chipped porcelain doll she found in a forgotten cupboard, and experience a sudden, overwhelming rush of emotion. Clara's joy at a small comfort, her sorrow at its loss. It was as if Clara's emotions were bleeding directly into her own, leaving Elaine's once robust emotional defenses shattered. She began to see what Clara saw. Not just visions of the past but the present. The air around objects shimmered with faint, ethereal auras, reflections of the emotions or events that had transpired around them. The walls of the house sometimes seemed translucent, allowing her fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving within the stone itself, echoes of others who had lived and died within Blackwood Manor, trapped in the ancient fabric of the place. These were not frightening figures, merely lost, confused, their voices faint whispers that Clara seemed to calm with a gentle, unseen touch. Clara, it seemed, was protecting her from the deeper, more chaotic echoes of the house, guiding her through this new, terrifying reality. This amplified perception was overwhelming. The world became a cacophony of unseen stimuli, a constant barrage of sights and sounds that pushed Elaine to the brink of sensory overload. She found herself retreating into the back room more and more, seeking the familiar presence of Clara amidst the chaos of the newly revealed house. Clara was a known terror, a specific pain, and in a twisted way, a comfort. Clara's influence wasn't just psychological, it became physical. Elaine would find herself moving objects without conscious intent. A door she was certain she closed would suddenly be open. A book she was reading would mysteriously move from her lap to the table. Once, she found herself standing at the bottom of the grand staircase, an antique vase clutched in her hands, with no memory of having retrieved it from its perch upstairs. It was as if Clara, through Elaine, was testing her boundaries, slowly reclaiming her physical agency. Moments of chilling clarity would puncture the haze of unreality. Elaine would catch her reflection in a dusty mirror, gaunt, wild-eyed, a stranger's sorrow in her gaze, and be consumed by a wave of pure horror. What is happening to me? I'm losing myself. She would try to fight back, to resist the insidious pull, to assert her own will. She would pack a small bag, resolved to leave, to drive away and never look back. But as she approached the front door, an invisible weight would settle upon her, a profound weariness that dragged at her limbs, a sudden overwhelming surge of Clara's own terror of abandonment. She would sink to the floor, exhausted, defeated, and the impulse to leave would fade, replaced by a quiet resignation. The house, or Clara's connection to it, wouldn't let her go. Her phone, a beacon to the rational world, lay forgotten in the study, its screen occasionally flashing with new messages ignored. Colleagues, friends, even her cleaner, desperate for a response. One afternoon, a series of urgent calls from Dr. Eris Thorne flashed on the screen. He was her former mentor, a pragmatic, renowned psychiatrist, whose call she had been meticulously avoiding. He left a terse voicemail, his calm voice laced with thinly veiled concern. "Elaine, it's Eris. Sarah Henderson called me. She's worried. Your assistant can't reach you. You need to call me back. Now." Sarah Henderson. Elaine's cousin, Margaret's niece. The very same Sarah who had admired Elaine's sharp intellect, who had occasionally visited Margaret in her later, quieter years. Sarah had always been tenacious, grounded, a woman who didn't tolerate nonsense. Her involvement was a clear sign that Elaine's disappearance had become a matter of serious concern. The mention of Sarah's name brought a brief, sharp pang of guilt. Elaine pictured Sarah's worried face, her kind eyes. But the thought of speaking to her, of trying to explain what was happening, felt impossible. How could she articulate the visceral reality of Clara, the haunting, the merging, to someone who lived in the rational world? They would simply diagnose her with a severe psychotic break, institutionalize her. And then Clara would be alone again. Forever. The thought was unbearable. Clara needed her. Clara needed to be seen. The house, as if sensing the external threat, seemed to brace itself. The whispers intensified, not from Clara now, but from the older, more primal hum that Elaine had felt at the pond. It was a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very stone walls. The scent of violets turned sharp, almost acrid. Elaine found herself drawn once again to the back room. It was her sanctuary, her crucible. As she stepped over the threshold, a sudden blinding flash of light exploded behind her eyes, followed by a profound shift. The room was no longer the dusty, desolate space it had been. It was pristine. The moth-eaten sheets on the four-poster bed were replaced by crisp, white linen. A fresh violet, impossibly vibrant and dewy, rested on the pillow. Two delicate porcelain teacups sat on the nightstand, one full of fragrant, steaming tea, the other empty as if someone had just finished their drink. The peeling wallpaper was gone, replaced by smooth, unblemished plaster. And scrawled across the walls, from floor to ceiling, in bold, triumphant charcoal script, were thousands of repetitions of a single phrase. "She's not alone anymore." Beneath it, in a larger, more confident hand that felt unnervingly like a blend of her own and Margaret's, a final, chilling declaration. Clara and Elaine. Elaine stared at the walls, her own name intertwined with Clara's, scrawled by an unseen hand, or perhaps by her own in a fugue state. A profound sense of peace, cold and absolute, washed over her, replacing the fear and the struggle. This was it. The culmination. The merging. She was no longer just Elaine. She was Elaine and Clara. Two souls, one existence. A faint, childlike giggle echoed softly from the rocking chair. It began to sway slowly, rhythmically. Not empty. Never empty. The muffled sound of a car crunching on the gravel drive drifted up from below, followed by the faint sound of voices, and then a firm, insistent knock on the front door. Sarah and Dr. Thorne. They had come for her. A slow, unsettling smile stretched across Elaine's lips. Clara's smile. They were too late. The house had claimed its own, and it was ready to protect what was theirs. The walls, once mere barriers, now felt like a living, breathing skin enclosing them, protecting them. A new coldness, sharp and defensive, emanated from the very stone. The humming deepened, a protective rumble. They weren't coming to save her. They were coming to disturb them. And the house would not allow it. The insistent knocking on the front door of Blackwood Manor reverberated through the ancient house, a harsh, discordant intrusion. It shattered the serene, albeit chilling peace that had settled over Elaine and Clara. Elaine, standing in the miraculously transformed back bedroom, felt a flicker of annoyance, a ripple of disturbance through the placid merge of her consciousness and Clara's. "They are disturbing us," a thought, half hers, half Clara's, whispered in her mind. Downstairs, Sarah Henderson, Elaine's cousin, shivered, though not entirely from the biting chill that seemed to emanate from the manor. Her patience had worn thin days ago, replaced by a gnawing fear. Elaine's uncharacteristic silence, her ignored calls, the cryptic, unsettling texts from a few days prior that read more like poetry than professional communication. It all pointed to something gravely wrong. Sarah had spent the last 2 days trying every avenue, contacting Elaine's assistant, her colleagues, even the local police who, without a crime committed, could do little more than make a welfare check. "Elaine, it's Sarah. Are you all right?" Sarah's voice, usually steady and clear, cracked slightly as she cupped her hands around her mouth, shouting towards the dark, vacant windows. The only response was the mournful sigh of the wind through the gables. Beside her, Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose professional life revolved around dissecting the human psyche, maintained a carefully composed expression. Yet inwardly he was deeply troubled. Elaine Miles was not just a colleague. She was a protégé, a brilliant mind he had personally mentored. Her sudden, complete withdrawal was alarming, and Sarah's frantic calls painted a disturbing picture. He had initially attributed it to severe burnout, perhaps a stress-induced depressive episode, but Sarah's increasing conviction that something more was amiss had compelled him to drive the 3 hours from London. "Let's try the back," Eris suggested, his voice calm, pragmatic. "Perhaps she's in the garden or out for a walk." It was a futile suggestion, a professional's attempt to maintain normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. They walked around the perimeter of the house, the gravel crunching underfoot, the overgrown gardens adding to the sense of neglect. The back of the house was even more shadowed, shrouded by ancient, skeletal trees. No sign of movement. The air grew colder here, distinctly so, even for a winter afternoon. "Elaine," Sarah called again, tapping on a window. "We're worried about you. Please just let us know you're okay." From within the back bedroom on the second floor, Elaine heard the muffled voices, the insistence. A wave of irritation rippled through her. "They want to take me away. Take Clara away." The walls of the room, still so miraculously pristine, seemed to thrum with a defensive energy, a low, protective growl that Elaine felt more than heard. Clara was agitated. "We are quite well, thank you," Elaine murmured, her voice sounding oddly flat, almost detached. She imagined the words drifting down to them, though she knew they wouldn't hear. "We are here. We are safe. We are finally seen." Eris, noticing the profound chill emanating from the back of the house, pulled out his phone. "I'm taking some temperature readings, Sarah," he said, more to himself than to her. The digital thermometer's readout plummeted as he approached the back wall, registering temperatures that defied the mild winter air outside. That's unusual. A significant thermal anomaly. His scientific curiosity, usually so reserved, was piqued. Sarah, meanwhile, had found the hidden spare key beneath the garden gnome, a relic from Margaret's more whimsical days. "Got it," she announced, relief flooding her voice. "Grandma Margaret always kept one here. Come on." They made their way back to the imposing front door. The key turned with a rusty groan, and the heavy oak swung inward, revealing the vast, silent, dusty maw of Blackwood Manor. The interior was shocking. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, thick as smoke. Cobwebs draped every surface like macabre lace. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of age and neglect, mingling with that sickly sweet, persistent perfume of violets. Books lay haphazardly on the floor, papers were scattered, furniture was askew. It was the antithesis of Elaine's usual fastidious order. "Good heavens," Eris muttered, surveying the scene, his professional composure visibly faltering. "This is not good." He scanned the room, his eyes picking up the subtle signs of rapid decline. The unread mail, the half-empty coffee mug with a ring of dried residue, the faint footprints in the dust. "Elaine?" Sarah's voice echoed through the cavernous hall, laced with a growing sense of dread. There was no reply. Only the house, creaking and groaning around them, its silence profound. They ascended the grand staircase, their footsteps muffled by thick layers of dust. The air grew colder with each step. Eris pulled out his thermometer again. The reading continued to drop as they reached the second-floor landing. "It's freezing up here, Sarah," he observed, his voice now devoid of professional detachment, replaced by genuine concern. Then they saw it. The back bedroom door. It stood open, a rectangle of unnerving light spilling from within, contrasting starkly with the dusty, shadowed hallway. A faint, almost imperceptible humming sound, like a child's lullaby, drifted from the room. Sarah looked at Eris, her eyes wide with a shared, unspoken apprehension. They exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement that this was beyond any rational explanation. They pushed the door further open and stepped into the back room. The sight that greeted them was a profound shock, a jarring contradiction to the rest of the neglected manor. The room was pristine, impossibly clean. The walls, previously peeling wallpaper, were now smooth, unblemished plaster, covered from floor to ceiling in thousands of repetitions of childlike drawings and phrases, scrawled in what looked like charcoal or burnt wood. The moth-eaten sheets on the four-poster bed were replaced by crisp, white linen pulled taut. A single, impossibly vibrant and dewy violet rested on the pillow. Two delicate porcelain teacups sat on the nightstand, one full of fragrant, steaming tea, steam still rising faintly, the other empty as if someone had just finished their drink. And then they saw Elaine. She was seated in the rocking chair facing the window, her back to them. Her hair, usually neatly styled, was tangled and wild, falling around her shoulders. She was wearing a faded, almost translucent white gown, impossibly old, that seemed to hang loosely on her frail frame. Her skin was translucent, almost luminous in the filtered light, her arms thin as twigs. As she slowly turned her head at their entrance, her eyes, once sharp and analytical, were wide, vacant, and alarmingly bright, holding an ancient sorrow that wasn't entirely her own. A faint, unsettling smile played on her lips, a mixture of ethereal peace and something far more chilling. "Elaine," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Elaine's smile widened, but her eyes remained distant. "Oh, hello, Sarah. Dr. Thorne. How kind of you to visit." Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth, with a faint, childlike lilt. It was Elaine's voice, yet not entirely. Eris, ever the diagnostician, began to speak, his voice calm, measured, attempting to ground her in reality. "Elaine, we're concerned. You haven't been answering calls. You seem unwell. We need to get you some help." Elaine tilted her head, her gaze drifting past them towards the door, then back to the walls covered in writing. "Unwell? Oh no. We've never felt better. We're finally seen. Finally heard." Her hand, thin and pale, reached out and gently stroked the armrest of the rocking chair, almost a caress. As she did, the chair creaked softly, rhythmically, as if a third, unseen presence was acknowledging her touch. Eris, noticing the impossible perfection of the room, the scent of fresh tea, the vibrancy of the violet, walked forward, his brow furrowed in deep concern. He saw the charcoal drawings on the walls, the chilling phrases repeated over and over. "She's not alone anymore. We are free. You understand now." And finally, prominently displayed above the bed, Clara and Elaine. "Elaine, who wrote this?" Eris asked, his voice losing its professional detachment, a tremor of genuine alarm entering it. He reached out as if to touch one of the drawings. As his hand approached the wall, the air in the room suddenly plummeted in temperature. An unseen force slammed the back bedroom door shut with a resounding bang that echoed through the house, rattling the windows. The single electric lamp in the hall flickered and died, plunging the corridor into darkness. A howling, frigid wind manifested inside the room, swirling around them, tearing at their clothes, carrying with it an acrid, sharp scent of decay, momentarily overwhelming the violets. From the rocking chair, Elaine's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, intense fury. Her eyes, no longer distant, fixed on Eris with terrifying clarity. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer detached or childlike. It was a guttural snarl, amplified, distorted, echoing around the room. "Leave us alone." Objects in the room began to fly. The porcelain teacups on the nightstand shattered against the wall. A heavy antique clock from the mantelpiece hurtled towards Eris, missing his head by inches, smashing into the wall behind him. The very bed shook violently, the pristine white linen ripping. From the corners of Elaine's eyes, Sarah caught fleeting, distorted glimpses of a child's enraged face, superimposed over Elaine's own, a grotesque, horrifying meld of two beings. The rage radiating from Elaine was primal, ancient, and undeniably Clara's. Sarah screamed, clutching Eris's arm. "Eris, get us out of here." He didn't need to be told twice. This was beyond psychology, beyond science. This was a direct, violent manifestation of something truly malevolent. As they stumbled backward, tripping over discarded furniture in the now pitch-black hall, Elaine's voice echoed behind them, softer now, but laced with a chilling triumph. "You're too late. She's home. We are home. And we're not alone anymore." The back bedroom door, which had slammed shut, slowly creaked open again, just a sliver. A faint, childlike giggle drifted out, mingling with the soft, rhythmic creak of the rocking chair. They could feel eyes on them from the darkness within. The scent of violets, cloyingly sweet, followed them down the stairs. Sarah and Eris stumbled out of Blackwood Manor, gasping for breath, their hearts hammering. The cold, unyielding silence of the countryside felt like a sudden, unwelcome reprieve. They looked back at the house, a dark, looming silhouette against the darkening sky. The back bedroom window, previously dark, now seemed to glow faintly with a soft, ethereal light, an eerie beacon in the gathering gloom. What was that? Sarah choked out, clutching her chest, her face pale. Eris, his professional composure shattered, his scientific worldview rocked to its core, could only stare at the house, his mind reeling. I don't know, Sarah, he whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. But she's gone. Elaine is gone. He had come to save his colleague, but he now realized with horrifying certainty that he was too late. Elaine Miles, the brilliant, rational psychologist, was no more. Only Clara remained, triumphant, finally seen, finally heard, and finally no longer alone. And the house, her eternal prison, had become her willing accomplice. The chilling image of Elaine, consumed by an ancient rage, her voice distorted, her eyes burning with an alien fury, was seared into Eris Thorne's mind. He stood on the gravel drive of Blackwood Manor, the biting wind tearing at his coat, but it was the internal chill of profound shock that truly rattled him. His meticulously ordered world, built on decades of empirical observation and psychological theory, had just fractured into a million irreparable pieces. Sarah, beside him, was openly weeping, her body trembling uncontrollably. "We have to call someone," Sarah choked out, wiping tears from her face. "The police, an ambulance. She's not well, Eris. She's seriously unwell." Eris nodded, mechanically pulling out his phone, his fingers stiff. But even as he dialed, his mind raced, trying to grasp the impossible. What would he tell the authorities? That a seemingly empty house had slammed a door and hurled objects? That his brilliant colleague had transformed into a vessel for a vengeful child spirit? He, a renowned psychiatrist, would be laughed out of his profession, possibly institutionalized himself. "They won't understand, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "They'll see a neglected house and a woman experiencing a severe psychotic break. They'll sedate her, commit her. And judging by what we just witnessed, that might not be the answer she needs. Or even possible." He still called, of course. A fragmented account was given. An urgent welfare check on a colleague suffering a severe mental health crisis, possibly accompanied by aggressive behavior. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, utterly disconnected from the visceral terror they had just experienced. Help was dispatched. It would take time to arrive. While they waited, huddled by the car, the house loomed, silent and watchful. The faint, ethereal glow in the back bedroom window seemed to pulse, almost mockingly. Eris, despite his shock, felt a familiar pull, the insatiable intellectual curiosity of the scientist. He tried to process what he'd seen. The impossible perfection of the back room, the written words, the sheer force of the poltergeist activity. It defied every known law of physics and psychology. "It's Clara," Sarah whispered, her voice raw. "That's what Grandma Margaret wrote in her journals. The little girl who was different. The one who drowned. Eris looked at her sharply. You knew about these journals? Sarah nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Elaine mentioned them. Said Grandma Margaret kept extensive diaries about the house. She said they mentioned a Clara, but there was no record of her. This was a critical piece of information. Elaine hadn't just been experiencing a breakdown, she had been researching a historical anomaly. An erased life. Where are these journals, Sarah? Are they still in the house? Presumably in the study where Elaine was working, Sarah replied, her eyes wide with apprehension. But, after that, Eris. I don't know if we should go back in. Eris considered this. The risk was immense, but the potential knowledge was even greater. If Margaret, Elaine's grandmother, had documented this, perhaps she had also documented how to combat it, or at least how to understand it. He had to try. For Elaine. Stay here, Sarah, he instructed, his voice firm. Keep your phone ready. If anything at all, call again. And don't go in. Sarah stared at him, her face pale. Eris, no. You can't go back in there. Look what it did. I have to, Sarah, he said, his gaze fixed on the menacing silhouette of the house. If there's any hope of understanding what's happening to Elaine, it's in those pages. Before Sarah could protest further, he grabbed his emergency medical kit from the car, a sturdy, small bag filled with basic first aid and tranquilizers, and marched back towards the manor. The scent of violets, sharp and cloying, met him at the threshold. The house was utterly silent, a deceptive stillness that felt more menacing than the previous chaos. He entered cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. Dust motes, thick as fog, swirled in the beam. He moved quickly to the study, the heavy door already ajar. The room was just as he remembered from his previous brief entry, cluttered but bearing the undeniable signs of Elaine's recent occupancy. On Margaret's mahogany desk, amidst scattered papers, lay a stack of leather-bound journals. Eris snatched them up, along with Elaine's own notebook which lay open. He saw the scrawled words, Clara and Elaine, and a chilling tremor ran down his spine. He quickly stuffed them into his bag. He also noticed, sitting almost imperceptibly on the desk's edge, a small, tarnished silver locket. He picked it up, its cold weight surprisingly heavy. It seemed to pulse faintly with an unseen energy. He tucked it into his pocket, an instinctive decision. Just as he turned to leave, a sound. Not a creak, not a whisper. A low, mournful hum that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house, vibrating through the floorboards, through the air, through his very bones. It was the same sound Sarah had described to him from their position outside, but amplified, raw, filled with an ancient, resonant power. The air in the study grew impossibly cold, the temperature plummeting in seconds, turning his breath to mist. Then from the darkness beyond the study door, he heard a new sound. The slow, rhythmic dragging of something heavy across the floor. Closer. Too close. Eris bolted. He didn't look back, not even to confirm what was moving. He sprinted through the hall, down the stairs, the low hum growing louder, the dragging sound gaining speed behind him. He burst out of the front door, gasping, almost colliding with Sarah. What was that? Sarah cried, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know, Eris choked out, clutching his bag. But I have the journals. And this. He pulled out the locket, its surface still dull but radiating a faint, cold energy. As if on cue, the back bedroom window flared with a brighter, more agitated light. The low hum from the house intensified, a furious, resonant growl. Just then, the distant wail of sirens pierced the quiet countryside. Blue lights flashed through the trees, growing steadily brighter. The police and presumably the paramedics were almost here. Eris and Sarah huddled together, watching as 2 police cruisers and an ambulance pulled up the drive. The officers, brisk and professional, approached the house, their faces initially skeptical. Welfare check, you say? Anyone home? Eris, regaining some of his composure, took the lead. My colleague, Dr. Elaine Miles. We believe she's in there. We're concerned for her mental state. She's been highly distressed. He carefully omitted the poltergeist activity. The officers exchanged a glance. Right. Stay here, ma'am, sir. We'll go check. They entered the house, their flashlights cutting through the dust. Eris and Sarah watched from the drive, their hearts pounding. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. From within, they heard muffled voices, the creak of floorboards, then silence. Followed by more murmuring. And then a shouted curse. Suddenly, one of the officers reappeared at the front door, his face pale, his eyes wide. He held a hand to his head. Nothing. No one in here. And something just hit me. He looked disoriented, almost fearful. A second officer emerged, his face grim. Place is empty. And that back room upstairs? He trailed off, shaking his head. The door slammed shut on its own when I tried to open it, and it's freezing in there. Unnaturally cold. Just a draft, probably. His voice was laced with a forced nonchalance that didn't quite mask his unease. Are you sure? Eris asked, his voice sharp. We saw her. She was definitely in the back room. Nobody here now, sir, the first officer insisted, rubbing his temple. Looks like she must have slipped out the back. Perhaps while you were around the side of the house. He avoided their gaze. It was clear he didn't want to discuss whatever he had experienced. The paramedics, after a quick assessment, concluded there was no immediate emergency. They advised Eris and Sarah to file a missing persons report if Elaine didn't reappear. The officers, clearly uncomfortable with the atmosphere of the house, completed their brief report, noting the empty property and the thermal anomalies as possible broken windows or structural issues. They left as quickly as they could, their flashing blue lights receding down the lane, taking with them the last vestiges of conventional order. Silence descended upon Blackwood Manor once more, deeper and more profound than before. Elaine was gone. Vanished. The house, dark and menacing, stood sentinel, its secrets locked tighter than ever. Eris and Sarah retreated to Eris's car. He turned on the interior light and pulled out the journals and Elaine's notebook. Sarah leaned over, her gaze falling on the open page of Elaine's notebook. Clara and Elaine. She's not gone, Eris, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She's still in there. With Clara. Eris looked at the locket in his hand, then at the menacing silhouette of Blackwood Manor against the moonless sky. The faint, high-pitched giggle from the back bedroom window seemed to drift across the expanse, a chilling, triumphant sound that only he and Sarah could hear. I think you're right, Sarah, Eris said, his voice grim. And I think these journals are our only key to understanding what happened to her. And perhaps to getting her back. He opened the first of Margaret's journals, its brittle pages whispering ancient secrets. He had walked into this believing in science and psychology. Now he faced a reality that defied every textbook, every diagnostic tool. Elaine, his brilliant, rational protégé, had become one with a ghost. And Eris Thorne, the pragmatist, was about to delve into a world he never believed existed, a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between sanity and possession, were terrifyingly fluid. The adventure had just begun, but the horror had already claimed its first victim. The last vestiges of the police cruiser's flashing blue lights had long since vanished down the winding lane, leaving Blackwood Manor to its own devices, a dark, silent sentinel under a starless sky. Eris Thorne sat in his parked SUV, the engine still running, providing a thin shield against the biting cold. Beside him, Sarah was curled into herself, shivering despite the car's heater, staring out at the looming silhouette of the house. The faint, triumphant giggle he'd heard just moments ago from the back bedroom window still echoed in his ears, a chilling, impossible sound. He was a man of science, a renowned psychiatrist, his career built on the bedrock of empirical data, verifiable phenomena, and the intricate, explainable workings of the human mind. Yet, what he had witnessed in Blackwood Manor defied every principle he held sacred. The inexplicable cold, the poltergeist activity, Elaine's terrifying transformation. It was beyond the realm of rational diagnosis. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if the very laws of physics had momentarily suspended themselves. "She's gone, Eris," Sarah whispered, her voice raw, fractured. "My cousin, she's gone." Eris looked at her, his gaze distant. "I don't know, Sarah," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Perhaps not entirely. What we saw, it was a merging, an integration, not an obliteration." He was already thinking like a clinician trying to find a framework, however bizarre, to understand. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, tarnished silver locket. It was surprisingly warm now, radiating a faint, almost imperceptible heat against his palm. This was on Elaine's desk. "It feels alive," Sarah gasped, leaning closer. "That's it. Grandma Margaret mentioned a locket in her journals, but I don't think Elaine ever found it. It was Clara's." Eris frowned. "Clara's? But Margaret's entry said, drowned. And lost. How could it be Clara's if there's no official record of her?" "That's what Elaine was trying to figure out," Sarah said, tears welling again. "She was obsessed. Said there were hints of a cover-up. Something the family wanted to keep secret. The missing piece." The puzzle began to coalesce, terrifyingly. Eris turned on the interior light, its glow too weak to dispel the oppressive gloom that seemed to emanate from the manor. He pulled out the leather-bound journals from his bag, along with Elaine's notebook. The notebook fell open to the page Elaine had scrawled upon, "Clara and Elaine." He flipped through Margaret's journals, his eyes scanning the frantic entries, the frantic underlines, the stark contrast between Margaret's once precise handwriting and her later desperate scrawl. He devoured the passages Elaine had shown him, but now he searched for new meaning, for any detail, any clue that might explain the impossible. He read of Margaret's increasing fear, her desperate attempts to understand Clara, to appease the unseen presence. He found more instances of Margaret describing Clara's gifts, not just seeing auras but hearing the thoughts of others, sensing emotions as vivid colors, even glimpsing future events. She saw the accident before it happened, the lorry overturning on the old road. Warned Mother, but Mother just hushed her. Said it was nonsense. Another wild fancy. These were descriptions of genuine psychic sensitivity, raw and untrained, terrifying in a child, especially in the restrictive social climate of the 1930s. Eris, despite himself, felt a shiver of professional recognition. He had encountered patients with extreme empathy, individuals who could sometimes intuit emotions. But this was on an entirely different scale. Psychic abilities? His rational mind recoiled, but the evidence, however unscientific, was mounting. He found Margaret's earliest entries regarding Clara. Clara had been born in 1924, a surprise child, much younger than Margaret. The family had lived in the manor for generations, a proud, insular lineage. Clara's mother, Elaine's great-grandmother, a woman named Eleanor, was portrayed as rigid, pious, obsessed with appearances. Her reaction to Clara's difference was one of escalating fear and shame. Eleanor began to confine her, Margaret wrote in an entry from late 1931. Small things at first. Not allowing her to play with other children. Then keeping her in the back room during tea visits. For her own good, Eleanor would say. To protect her sensitive nature. But Clara was frightened. She saw the gray around Mother's sharp, cold fear, and it made her tremble. The journals chronicled Clara's slow descent into isolation. The back room, once simply a guest room, became a prison. Clara's desperate cries, her frantic banging on the door, the small, pitiful offerings Margaret would leave for her sister, a slice of cake, a forbidden picture book, a handful of fresh violets picked from the garden. The passage about June 12, 1933, remained the most agonizing. Eris reread it, his heart aching for the young Margaret, trapped between her sister's torment and her mother's cruelty. Eleanor insisted on the cleansing. A baptism of sorts. To drive out the strangeness. To save her soul. At the pond. I begged them. I begged them. Clara was so afraid of the water. But Eleanor dragged her. Her screams, they were not the screams of a child. They were the screams of something ancient, terrified. The water, it was too much. She struggled, and then, silence. Oh God, the silence. Eleanor just stood there. Cold. Unmoving. The Lord's will, she said. My fault. My fault. I should have. The entry dissolved into desperate, ink-blotted sobs. Eris closed the journal, his hands shaking. It wasn't an accident. It was a ritualistic drowning, a forced exorcism, orchestrated by a deluded, fearful woman. And Margaret, too young, too afraid, had been forced to witness it. The profound sense of loneliness Elaine had felt at the pond, the lingering despair, it was Clara's final moments, the terror and betrayal, imprinted upon the very landscape. Oh my God, Eris whispered, relaying the horrifying details to Sarah. Eleanor. Elaine's great-grandmother, she drowned Clara. A forced cleansing at the pond. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, tears streaming anew. No, that's barbaric. Why would she? And why no record? Why was it covered up? Shame, Eris stated, his voice grim. In that era, a mad child, a child with such sensitivities, would have brought immense shame upon the family. A public drowning would be unthinkable. A disappearance, perhaps, a quiet burial on the grounds. It would be easier to erase her from existence than to admit such a blemish on the family name. He considered the locket in his hand. Perhaps this locket and these journals were Margaret's way of ensuring Clara wasn't truly erased. Her secret testament. He flipped to the later journals, searching for any indication of how Margaret dealt with Clara's lingering presence. Margaret documented Clara's initial appearance as a haunting, faint whispers, the rocking chair, the cold spots. But then a chilling shift. She is growing stronger. She reaches for me. Not malicious, no. Just so lonely. She wants to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. And I am so very tired. Margaret's guilt over her inaction, her inability to save Clara, had left her vulnerable. The spirit, desperate for connection, had latched onto her. Margaret, through her later years, had been in a prolonged, low-level symbiotic relationship with Clara's spirit, a gentle, sorrowful haunting, fueled by Margaret's own grief and remorse. This is what's happening to Elaine, Eris realized, a horrifying clarity settling upon him. But exponentially. Elaine's psychological background, her empathy, her own burnout and vulnerability, they've made her the perfect host. Clara isn't just haunting her, she's merging with her. And that other presence, the ancient hum, it's feeding on the energy of this integration. On the trauma. He remembered the transformed back room, the fresh violet, the teacups. And the words, Clara and Elaine. It wasn't just a ghost story. It was a psychological and spiritual integration. Clara, erased from life, now sought to live again fully through the consciousness of her empathetic descendant. And the house, a silent witness to a century of pain, was facilitating it. We can't just leave her, Sarah, Eris said, his voice firm, no longer just a scientist, but a man compelled by a terrifying new understanding. Elaine isn't just unwell. She's becoming Clara. And Clara is angry. And lonely. And she wants to be free. He looked at the locket, then back at the dark house. And the way she wants to be free. I don't think it will leave Elaine intact. Sarah shuddered. What do we do? What can we do? The police didn't even see her. We have to understand the nature of what we're dealing with, Eris replied, tapping the journals. This isn't just a haunting. It's a traumatic imprint, a psychic entity rooted in deep, generational pain. And if Clara can show Elaine her memories, perhaps Elaine can show Clara something else. Something that allows her to finally rest. He began to formulate a plan, a desperate, unconventional strategy that pulled from the fringes of his psychiatric knowledge, combined with the raw, terrifying reality he had just witnessed. He would study every word of Margaret's journals, every detail of Clara's life and death. He would research psychic phenomena, spiritual cleansing rituals, anything that might offer a glimmer of hope. He wouldn't use tranquilizers or medication. They were useless against a ghost. He needed a different kind of intervention. A psychological one, yes, but also a spiritual one. His gaze returned to the locket. It was the only tangible link he had to Clara besides the journals. He tried the clasp again, exerting more pressure. This time, with a faint click, it opened. Inside, tarnished but intact, lay two tiny, sepia-toned photographs. One was of the stern-faced Eleanor, Clara's mother, her eyes cold and unforgiving. The other was Clara. Her eyes, though solemn, held a piercing intensity, a profound sadness, and yes, an uncanny resemblance to Elaine. And on the reverse side of Clara's photo, written in faint, elegant script, unlike Eleanor's rigid hand or Margaret's later scrawl, was a single chilling word. Remember. It was not lost. It was remember. A different plea, a different intent. Someone else had written it. Someone who wanted Clara remembered. But who? And why was this locket found by the road miles from the house? Had Elaine been taking it somewhere? Or was it placed there for her to find? The mystery deepened. Eris felt a surge of cold dread, mingled with an almost manic determination. He was no longer just saving a colleague. He was unraveling a century-old tragedy, a conspiracy of silence, and confronting a truth that would either break him or forge a new understanding of existence itself. Blackwood Manor stood dark and silent against the night, but within its walls, the fragile boundary between the living and the dead was dissolving. And Eris Thorne was now inextricably drawn into its horrifying current. The single word, remember, scrawled on the back of Clara's tiny sepia photograph inside the locket, resonated with Eris Thorne. It was a stark contrast to Margaret's frantic lost, a deliberate call to action from someone else, someone who wanted Clara's truth to be known. The elegant, almost delicate handwriting didn't match Eleanor's rigid script, nor Margaret's increasingly desperate scrawl. It added a new, tantalizing layer to the already complex tragedy. Who else knew? Who else had tried to ensure Clara would not be forgotten? And why had the locket been discarded by the roadside? Eris spent the next few days in a frenzied, almost manic state, fueled by strong coffee and an insatiable need for answers. He sequestered himself in a small, impersonal hotel room in Oakhaven, the scent of antiseptic and stale air a stark contrast to the cloying violets of Blackwood Manor. Sarah, too shaken to return to her own home, remained with him, offering what little support she could, though her own mind reeled from the events. They pored over Margaret's journals, Eris guiding Sarah to read specific passages, interjecting his own psychological interpretations. He focused on any mention of other family members, servants, or local acquaintances who might have been present during Clara's life, or even in the period immediately after her death. Margaret's journals revealed a tightly knit, insular family largely self-sufficient, with minimal interaction beyond carefully selected social calls. Servants were few and loyal, typically from local families who had served the miles for generations. But one name, mentioned fleetingly in Margaret's younger entries, caught Eris's attention: Aunt Penelope. Penelope was Eleanor's younger sister, Margaret's aunt. She was described as eccentric, artistic, and possessing a kindness Eleanor could not abide. Margaret hinted at Penelope's unconventional views and a strained relationship with Eleanor. Penelope had apparently visited Blackwood Manor sporadically in the late 1920s and early 1930s, often staying for weeks at a time, before she moved to London and was rarely spoken of again. Could Penelope be the one who wrote Remember? Eris wondered. An artistic soul, perhaps more open to understanding Clara's difference, alienated by Eleanor's cruelty. It was a compelling theory. He widened his online search, now looking for Penelope Miles, or her maiden name if it differed, in London archives, particularly focusing on genealogical records, art communities, or any institutions that dealt with parapsychology or unusual phenomena during that era. It was a long shot, but he was grasping at any thread. Meanwhile, Sarah, still deeply traumatized, found herself constantly checking her phone, hoping for a sign from Elaine. When none came, she shifted her energy to calling friends and acquaintances who knew Elaine, discreetly trying to gauge if anyone had seen or heard from her, or knew of any other strange occurrences in the countryside. Most offered sympathetic but unhelpful platitudes, suggesting Elaine was simply on a much-needed break. No one, of course, believed her when she tentatively hinted at strange occurrences at the house. The only person who listened without immediate dismissal was a Dr. Anya Sharma, a junior colleague of Elaine's, known for her open-minded research into consciousness and perception, a field often dismissed as fringe by more traditional psychiatrists. Sarah cautiously shared snippets of her and Eris's experience, without revealing the full, terrifying truth. Anya, intrigued, promised to look into some historical accounts of the Miles family herself, from a different angle than Eris. Eris, back in his hotel room, spent hours sifting through various online historical archives. He finally found a faint trail, a Penelope Eleanor Miles, born 1898, who had indeed moved to London in the mid-1930s. She became a rather obscure artist, exhibiting works often described as disturbing portraits of the unseen and ethereal landscapes. Critically, one exhibition catalog from 1937 included a piece titled The Lost Child of Wiltshire, described as a haunting abstract of a girl drowning in a sea of violets. Bingo! A shiver of triumph, quickly replaced by dread, ran through Eris. Penelope had known. She hadn't just known, she had expressed it through her art. She was the one. He continued to dig, finding Penelope's obituary from the late 1980s. She had died childless, leaving her estate to a small, private charity dedicated to the protection and understanding of exceptional minds. This was the clincher. Penelope had understood Clara. She had tried to remember her not just for herself but for the world. The problem was Penelope was long dead. Her charity, if it still existed, was unlikely to hold any further direct clues about Blackwood Manor or Clara. Eris needed to find someone who knew Penelope, someone who might have inherited her understanding or perhaps her files. Penelope had attempted her own interventions, gentle rituals, attempting to guide Clara to peace, to sever her from the collector. But she had failed. "The pull is too strong," she wrote in 1945. "Clara is intertwined. Only one who shares her blood, her sensitivity, and her compassion could possibly hope to unravel her from the collector's grasp. A vessel. And the cost would be immense." Eris felt a cold dread settle deep within him. Penelope had foreseen this. A vessel. Elaine. Her own unique psychological makeup, her empathy, her recent burnout and vulnerability, had made her the perfect candidate for Clara's merging and the collector's insidious grasp. He found a final, undated entry, scribbled on a loose sheet within Penelope's diary. It was a cryptic warning, a desperate last attempt to transmit knowledge across time. The collector is a hunger. It gathers echoes, feeds on unresolved suffering. It binds souls to the land. Clara is its key. To free her, one must understand both the historical trauma and the spiritual binding. One must confront the core wound, not just Clara's but the house's, the water, the mirror, and the sacrifice. The greatest sacrifice of all is the ego. The ego. Elaine, the renowned psychologist whose very identity was built on her intellect, her logical mind. And Penelope spoke of sacrifice. Eris and Sarah left the foundation, the London bustle a jarring contrast to the terrifying secrets they now carried. The locket, clutched in Eris's hand, now felt heavier, pulsing with a cold, almost predatory energy. They had found their answers, the terrifying roadmap to what was happening to Elaine. But the path ahead was shrouded in chilling ambiguity. They knew what they were up against. But how to fight it and what the ultimate cost would be remained horrifyingly unclear. The next step was to return to Blackwood Manor. And this time they wouldn't be just observers. They would be active participants in a battle for Elaine's soul, a battle against an ancient evil woven into the very fabric of the house. The drive back to Blackwood Manor felt interminable, a grim pilgrimage saturated with the chilling knowledge they had unearthed. The crisp, detached professionalism that had defined Eris Thorne's life was now irrevocably shattered. He, the pragmatist, the man of science, was charting a course into the very heart of the supernatural, driven by a desperate need to save Elaine, and by an unsettling fascination with the entity Penelope called the Silent Collector. Sarah, beside him, was a silent sentinel of dread, clutching a worn rosary Margaret had once given her, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon as if expecting the house to rise and consume them whole. The locket, still in Eris's pocket, pulsed with a cold, almost predatory energy that seemed to ebb and flow with his thoughts. The faint scent of violets, now intertwined with the metallic tang of old blood, a scent he couldn't explain, but recognized as primordial, permeated the car, making the air thick and heavy. He could feel Clara's presence not just as a mournful echo, but as a restless, agitated energy, intertwined with a deeper, more ancient malevolence. The Silent Collector was more than a concept now. It was a palpable hunger reaching out, anticipating their return. They arrived at Blackwood Manor just as the last sliver of twilight bled from the sky, leaving the house a monolithic silhouette against a bruised canvas of deep purple and indigo. The air itself was heavy, charged with an almost palpable tension, as if the very atoms vibrated with suppressed energy. The usual symphony of creaks and groans was absent. Instead, an unsettling stillness, broken only by the distant, mournful hoot of an owl, pervaded the grounds. The back bedroom window, which had previously held a faint glow, was now dark, utterly black, a blind eye staring out into the encroaching night. "It feels different," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Quieter, but more watchful." Eris nodded, his jaw tight. "It's waiting." They entered the manor through the back door, having decided against the ominous front entrance. The interior was colder than before, a biting chill that seeped into their bones independent of the external temperature. The air was thick with dust and the cloying scent of violets, now sickeningly sweet, almost suffocating. Eris's flashlight beam danced through the gloom, illuminating the disarray of the past days, the scattered papers, the overturned chair. The house felt less like a dwelling and more like a vast, breathing organism, its stone walls contracting around them. The hum began as they reached the foot of the grand staircase, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very air deep in their chests. It was the ancient sound Penelope had called the Silent Collector, and it was growing stronger, its hunger palpable. They ascended the stairs slowly, cautiously, Eris holding his bag containing the journals and Penelope's diary tight to his chest. The back bedroom door remained closed, an ominous slab of dark wood at the end of the corridor. The hum intensified, emanating directly from behind that door, a deep, resonant growl that promised unimaginable power. As they approached, the hum intensified to a deafening roar within their minds, blurring their senses. The air was thick with oppressive energy, making it difficult to breathe. The scent of violets was overwhelming, stinging their eyes. Eris could feel the locket in his pocket vibrating, resonating with the frequency of the hum. Then the door to the back bedroom slowly, deliberately began to open, revealing a sliver of profound darkness within. It wasn't the benevolent glow they had seen before. This was an abyss. From within the room, a voice. Not Elaine's, not Clara's, but something else entirely. It was deep, ancient, and seemed to speak from everywhere at once, from the very walls, the floor, the air itself. It was a voice that held the weight of centuries, resonating with untold suffering and infinite patience. She is ours. The words were not spoken aloud but imprinted directly onto their consciousnesses, raw and terrifying. This was the silent collector, the true entity that bound Clara and now Elaine to Blackwood Manor. Eris stumbled back, pulling Sarah with him. The sheer power of the voice, its ancient malevolence, was overwhelming. It wasn't the simple haunting of a lost spirit, it was a profound, cosmic horror. "We need to understand it," Eris gasped, his voice hoarse, clutching the bag containing the journals. Penelope said, "Confront the core wound. We need more information." They retreated to the study, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind them, though they knew it would offer little defense. The low hum still reverberated through the house, a constant reminder of the entity's presence. Eris frantically pulled out Penelope's diary, flipping to the final, undated entry. "The collector is a hunger. It gathers echoes, feeds on unresolved suffering. It binds souls to the land. Clara is its key. To free her, one must understand both the historical trauma and the spiritual binding. One must confront the core wound, not just Clara's but the house's, the water, the mirror, and the sacrifice. The greatest sacrifice of all is the ego. The core wound," Eris muttered, his eyes scanning the page. "Not just Clara's drowning but the act itself. The deliberate cruelty. The betrayal. And the house's wound, what does that mean?" Sarah, pale and trembling, pointed to a faded, hand-drawn map tucked into the back of Penelope's diary. It was a rough sketch of Blackwood Manor and its grounds, far more detailed than any official survey. On it, Penelope had marked specific locations with symbols. The pond was marked with a weeping eye, the back bedroom with a shattered mirror. And then, at the very heart of the house, beneath what appeared to be the oldest section of the foundations, a symbol that looked like a spiraling, grasping hand, surrounded by concentric circles. It was labeled, "The Nexus, where the veil is thin." The Nexus, Eris breathed. The source of the collector's power. The point where the veil is thinnest. He remembered Penelope's chilling observation. "The land is old here. Very old. And hungry." The house was built on a place of inherent vulnerability, a nexus of psychic energy, perhaps even a place of ancient, forgotten bloodshed or suffering that predated the Miles family. Eleanor's act, Clara's suffering, had merely provided a perfect, fresh wound for the entity to latch onto and feed from. The house itself was the architect of Clara's anguish and now Elaine's. And the mirror, Sarah whispered, pointing to the shattered mirror symbol for the back bedroom. "What does that mean?" Eris remembered Penelope's vague artistic descriptions, portraits of the unseen, ethereal landscapes. He looked at the locket again, at Clara's face. And he remembered Elaine, herself a brilliant mind, now consumed. The mirror, Eris mused, thinking aloud, is a symbol of reflection, of identity, of seeing oneself. Clara was different. She saw things. Perhaps her reflection was distorted to her. Or perhaps the mirror was where she truly saw the entities others could not. And in the context of Eleanor's cruelty, her mother was trying to shatter Clara's identity, to force her to conform, to make her deny what she saw. He looked at Sarah, a grim determination hardening his features. This isn't just about Clara. It's about Eleanor's legacy of fear and control. It's about the land itself. And Elaine is caught in the middle of it all. Their plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. They needed to understand the nexus, the core wound of the house, and somehow sever Clara's binding to the collector, allowing her to finally find peace and hopefully releasing Elaine. But first they had to confront Eleanor. Not the physical Eleanor, long dead, but her psychic imprint, her legacy of cruelty that still permeated the house, a crucial fuel for the silent collector. Margaret's journals had hinted at Eleanor's presence, an oppressive memory that haunted Margaret even after her mother's death. And in the fragmented visions Elaine had experienced, Eleanor's voice had been cold, cutting, full of terrifying piety. "We need to go back to the back room," Eris said, his voice firm, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "And this time we're not just looking for Elaine. We're looking for Eleanor." The hum of the silent collector, a low guttural thrum, vibrated through the study floorboards, a constant, menacing reminder of the ancient entity that permeated Blackwood Manor. Eris and Sarah stood, poised at the study door, the faint glow of Eris's flashlight the only beacon against the encroaching darkness of the hall. The decision to return to the back bedroom, not just for Elaine, but to confront the psychic imprint of Eleanor, Clara's cruel mother, felt both necessary and utterly terrifying. "Are you sure about this, Eris?" Sarah whispered, her hand clutching the rosary tighter, her knuckles white. Her eyes were wide, darting into the oppressive shadows beyond the door. What if she's too far gone? What if this Eleanor? What if she's just as dangerous? Eris took a deep breath, steeling himself. Penelope's diary specifically mentioned the core wound. Eleanor's act of cruelty, driven by fear and shame, was the primary trauma that bound Clara and, by extension, fueled the collector. If we can somehow disrupt that, sever Eleanor's lingering influence, it might weaken the binding. And, he added, his voice grim, we have to try. For Elaine. He led the way, his powerful tactical flashlight cutting a stark path through the gloom. The hallway felt colder than ever, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into their bones. The scent of violets, cloying and sweet, was almost overpowering now, thick enough to taste. As they ascended the grand staircase, each creak of the old wood seemed amplified, a watchful presence accompanying their every step. The hum of the collector intensified, a low, menacing growl that resonated directly in their minds, a pressure behind their eyes. They reached the second-floor landing. The back bedroom door, which Eris had found slightly ajar when he first entered, was now firmly closed. An eerie silence emanated from it, a stillness more unsettling than any sound. The glowing light they had seen from outside was gone, leaving the room shrouded in absolute darkness. Eris reached out a trembling hand and pushed the door. It didn't resist. It swung open silently, revealing a void of impenetrable blackness. The air that rushed out was frigid, instantly turning their breath to thick clouds of mist. The hum intensified, vibrating violently, shaking the very floor beneath their feet. "Hello?" Eris called into the darkness, his voice echoing, swallowed by the oppressive void. "Elaine? Are you there?" No reply. Only the cold, the suffocating silence, and the vibrating hum. He stepped inside, Sarah close behind him, her hand gripping his arm. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the pristine, impossible state of the room. The fresh violet on the pillow, the 2 teacups on the nightstand, the walls still covered in the childlike scrawl, "Clara and Elaine." The rocking chair sat facing the window as before. The air in the room was thick, almost viscous, with a cloying scent of violets and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang like old blood and something sharp like iron or a very old, unyielding rage. "Elaine," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She swept her own small flashlight beam around the room, but it revealed nothing but the familiar furnishings. Then from the rocking chair, a slow, deliberate creak. "What? Twice?" Eris focused his beam on the chair. It rocked slowly, rhythmically. But it was empty. Utterly empty. Suddenly a voice. Not the childlike lilt of Elaine, nor Clara's mournful whisper. This voice was cold, sharp, imperious, crackling with a terrifying, self-righteous fury. It resonated directly into their minds, overriding the collector's hum, cutting through it like shattered glass. She deserved it. The strangeness. The sin. It had to be cleansed. Elaine's great-grandmother Eleanor. Her psychic imprint, as cold and unyielding in death as she had been in life. The architect of anguish. The temperature in the room plummeted further, becoming unbearable. Frost began to appear on the window panes, even on the surface of the nightstand. The violet on the pillow shriveled instantly, turning black and brittle. The tea in the teacups turned to ice, cracking the delicate porcelain with a sharp ping. "You drowned a child." Sarah cried out, her voice raw with outrage, momentarily forgetting her fear. "Your own niece." The imperious voice snarled, vibrating through the very air. "A child possessed. A blight upon this house. The Lord guided my hand. I saved her soul from perdition." The air shimmered, twisting, and for a fleeting moment Eris saw a tall, gaunt figure, indistinct and shadowy, standing behind the rocking chair, her outline rigid with self-righteous piety. Her presence radiated a profound, chilling coldness, mingled with an intense, suffocating shame. "No, Eleanor!" Eris shouted, trying to inject his voice with authority, to break through the oppressive psychic attack. "You murdered her. You created this. Your fear and cruelty trapped her here, and now it's consuming your granddaughter." The shadowy figure intensified, looming over them. The very walls seemed to writhe, the plaster covered in Clara's drawings twisting into grotesque, tormented faces. The voice roared, shaking the room. "Silence! You know nothing. I protected this lineage. I protected this house from the infected." Suddenly Clara's childish voice, thin and desperate, pierced through Eleanor's rage. "She hurt me," she pushed. "I saw the gray, so cold." It was a faint, struggling whisper trying to assert itself against the dominant fury. Then Elaine's voice, a distorted echo, both Elaine and Clara at once. "She made us hide, she made us quiet, she locked us away." Eleanor's psychic presence surged, overwhelming the room. The rocking chair began to rock violently, slamming against the floorboards with loud thuds. The faint hum of the silent collector intensified, growing into a guttural roar, hungry, agitated, feeding on Eleanor's immense, unyielding rage and Clara's enduring pain. It was a cacophony of psychic torment. "You're feeding it," Eris shouted, his voice strained, pushing against the invisible pressure in the room. "Your unresolved shame, your cruelty, your hatred, it's a feast for this entity. It's what's keeping Clara bound here." The shadowy figure of Eleanor advanced, her presence radiating a suffocating wave of despair and rage. Eris felt an icy hand grasp his arm, the cold so intense it burned. His vision blurred, filled with distorted images of a stern, disapproving face, eyes filled with righteous fury. He felt a profound sense of inadequacy, of being judged and found utterly wanting. This was Eleanor's core wound, her rigid, unyielding ego, her pathological need for control and appearances, her absolute inability to accept difference. This was what Penelope had meant by the greatest sacrifice of all is the ego. Eleanor's ego was still here, still fighting. Sarah cried out as she felt a similar chilling touch. The rosary in her hand grew intensely hot, almost burning her skin. She gasped, dropping it to the floor. As it hit the wood, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of gold light emanated from the cross, pushing back against the shadows, but it was quickly swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "We need to sever the connection," Eris yelled, pushing Sarah back towards the door, away from Eleanor's overwhelming presence. "We need to weaken the collector's grip." He knew instinctively what Penelope's diary had hinted at. To free Clara, they needed to dismantle Eleanor's psychic legacy, to force the architect of anguish to confront her own monstrous acts, to finally acknowledge her guilt and the truth of her cruelty, rather than her self-righteous delusion. He pulled Penelope's diary from his bag, flipping frantically to the back. There, sketched on a loose page, was a series of intricate, almost alchemical symbols, surrounded by specific instructions. Penelope's desperate attempt at a cleansing ritual, designed not just for a ghost, but for an entity that fed on psychic residue. It involved objects, something from the water, something from the mirror, and something of Clara's. They had the locket. They needed the others. And they needed to use Eleanor's own psychic energy against her. As he looked up, the shadowy figure of Eleanor filled the doorway, blocking their exit. Her voice resonated, a low, triumphant growl. "You will not leave. You will join her. All of you will remember." The hum of the collector intensified, a physical force pressing down on them, stealing their breath. The walls pulsed with a dark, consuming energy. Eris felt a desperate surge of adrenaline. They were trapped. But he also felt a desperate resolve. They wouldn't let Elaine be lost. And they wouldn't let Eleanor's cruel legacy triumph. The battle for Blackwood Manor, for Elaine's soul, had truly begun.